phone rang 3 times before Elena Marsh realized her hand was shaking. She had not meant to call this number. She had meant to call her sister, Nora, to tell her she would be late again, that the law firm had piled another case file on her desk at 9 at night, that she was tired in a way sleep could not fix. But her fingers had slipped on the screen, and now a stranger's voice filled her ear, low and steady, asking who was calling at this hour. She almost hung up. Her thumb hovered over the red circle, but something in the voice stopped her. It was not impatience. It was curiosity, calm and unhurried, like the man on the other end had all the time in the world and had decided, for reasons she could not guess, to spend some of it on her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I think I dialed the wrong number." "Maybe," the voice said. "Or maybe you dialed exactly the right one." She laughed despite herself, a short, tired sound. That's a strange thing to say to someone you've never met. Most true things sound strange the first time you hear them. Elena sat down on the edge of her bed. Outside her window, the city hummed with late traffic, red and white lights sliding across wet asphalt. She should have ended the call there. She had an early morning ahead of her, another stack of contracts to review before her boss arrived, another day of being invisible in an office full of people who barely learned her name. But the voice asked her a question, simple and direct. "You sound exhausted. Long day?" "Long year," she admitted, and immediately wondered why she had said something so honest to a person she did not know. "Tell me about it," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." So she did. She told him about the firm, about the partner who dumped extra work on her because she never complained, about the apartment with the leaking faucet she could not afford to fix, about her mother's illness 3 years ago that had drained her savings and her spirit in equal measure. She told him things she had not told her closest friends, and the strange part was how easy it felt, how the darkness of her bedroom and the anonymity of his voice made confession simple instead of frightening. He listened. He did not interrupt with advice she had not asked for. He did not rush her along. Every so often he asked a quiet question that showed he had actually heard her, not just waited for his turn to speak. When she finally paused, embarrassed by how much she had said, he spoke again. "You carry a lot," he said. "More than you let people see." "How would you know that? You don't know me." "I know enough," he said, and there was something in his tone, something old and careful, that made her skin prickle in a way she could not explain. The call went on. Minutes became nearly an hour. She learned nothing about him, not his name, not his city, not his job, and yet she felt she understood something essential about him that she could not put into words. His voice had a texture to it, a depth that seemed to vibrate against her chest, rather than simply enter her ear. She told herself it was tiredness playing tricks on her senses. "What's your name?" he finally asked, so gently that it did not feel like a demand. "Elena," she said. "Elena Marsh." There was silence on the line. Not the silence of a dropped call, but a heavy, thoughtful quiet, as if the name had struck something deep inside him and knocked the air from his lungs. It lasted only 3 or 4 seconds, but to Elena it felt endless. "Elena," he repeated, like he was testing the shape of the word in his mouth. "That's a beautiful name." "And yours?" He did not answer. Instead he said, "Get some rest. You'll need it." "Need it for what?" But the line was already dead. She stared at her phone, the call log showing a number she did not recognize, a duration of 58 minutes. She thought about calling back, some mixture of curiosity and unease pushing her thumb toward the screen. But exhaustion won out, and she set the phone on her nightstand and let sleep pull her under, before she could think any further about the odd, hollow feeling his final words had left behind. She dreamed strange things that night, dreams of forests and moonlight, and eyes that glowed the color of steel, though when she woke, she remembered none of it clearly, only a lingering sense that something had shifted, some small hinge in her life had turned without her noticing. Morning came too fast. Sunlight cut through her thin curtains and landed directly on her face, and she groaned, reaching for her phone to check the time. It was earlier than her alarm, barely past 6, and yet noise from outside had already pulled her from sleep. Car doors, voices, the low rumble of engines idling. She sat up and parted the curtains just enough to look down at the street below her apartment building. 3 black vehicles were parked along the curb, sleek and expensive, the kind of cars that did not belong on her modest street lined with delivery vans and dented sedans. People were stepping out of them, 6 or 7 at first, then more, all dressed in dark, tailored clothing, with a small silver emblem stitched into their collars, a wolf's head inside a circle. They moved with a precision that reminded her of soldiers, or perhaps something closer to hunters, methodical and unbothered by the early hour. Her stomach tightened. She told herself it was nothing, a film crew perhaps, or some corporate event happening nearby that had nothing to do with her. But then, a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful, stepped toward the front door of Elena's building and pressed the buzzer. Elena's own buzzer. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She backed away from the window, as if the glass itself could betray her position, though she knew it was foolish, that they could not possibly see her from the street. She grabbed her phone, uncertain who to call, uncertain if this was a mistake, or a threat, or something else entirely. The buzzer sounded again, more insistent this time. She thought about the wrong number. She thought about the voice, the silence after she had said her name, the strange finality of his goodbye. Get some rest. You'll need it. Had he done this? Had that phone call somehow led these strangers to her door less than 8 hours later? It seemed impossible, and yet the timing was too precise to be coincidence. Elena moved to her small kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could anchor her spinning thoughts. She was a paralegal, not a criminal, not someone who owed money to dangerous people, not someone with secrets worth this kind of attention. Her life was ordinary, unremarkable, small in all the ways that should have kept her safe from whatever this was. The buzzer rang a third time, longer, more deliberate. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. A voice, amplified slightly, speaking through the building's intercom system, with a calm authority that suggested this was not the first door they had opened this morning. Elena Marsh, the woman's voice said. We are not here to harm you. We need only a few minutes of your time. Elena stood frozen in her kitchen, staring at the intercom speaker on her wall, her breath coming shallow and fast. Whoever these people were, wherever they had come from, one truth was already clear to her. Her ordinary life had ended the moment she dialed the wrong number, and there was no going back to the way things had been before. She pressed her palm flat against the cool counter and forced herself to breathe. Panic would not help her think, and thinking was the only tool she had left. She ran through every possibility her mind could offer. Debt collectors did not travel in 3 matching vehicles with tailored suits and matching emblems. Reporters did not speak with that kind of calm, practiced patience. And criminals, at least the ones she had read about in case files at the firm, rarely announced themselves through a building intercom with such polite restraint. That left only one explanation that made any sense to her racing thoughts, however absurd it seemed. The call, the stranger's voice, the silence after she gave her name. Somehow, in some way she could not begin to understand, that conversation had reached these people, and they had found her before the sun had even fully risen. The intercom buzzed again, softer this time, almost patient. Elena crossed the small living room and pressed the button to speak, her voice barely steady. Who are you? What do you want? My name is Freya, the woman said, her tone even and unbothered by the question. I work for someone who spoke with you last night. He asked us to make sure you were safe. Safe from what? That is not a conversation for an intercom, Miss Marsh. Please, come down, or allow us up. Either way works for us, though I suspect you would prefer the choice remain yours. Elena's mind snagged on the phrase. The choice remain yours. It sounded rehearsed, like something Freya had said many times before, to many different frightened people standing behind many different doors. That thought did not comfort her. It suggested a pattern, a system, something larger than one strange phone call and one restless night. She glanced toward her bedroom, where her phone sat charging beside her bed, the call log still showing that unfamiliar number and its 58-minute duration. Some instinct told her that whoever was downstairs already knew every detail of that call, perhaps even the words she had spoken, the fears she had confessed to a stranger in the dark. The thought made her face burn with a mixture of embarrassment and fear. Give me 10 minutes, she said finally, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. Take the time you need, Freya replied. We are not going anywhere. Elena released the intercom button and pressed her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor of her small living room, knees pulled to her chest. She thought about calling Nora, her sister, the one person who would answer at this hour no matter what. But what would she even say? That strangers in matching cars had come for her because of a wrong number? It sounded like the beginning of a joke, not a warning worth waking someone for. Instead, she opened her contacts and stared at the unfamiliar number from the night before. Her thumb hovered over the call button. If this Freya worked for the man on the phone, then perhaps calling him now would answer more questions than opening her front door ever could. She pressed the button before she could talk herself out of it. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, the same deep, steady voice answered, though this time, there was no curiosity in it, only quiet reassurance. "Elena, your people are outside my building," she said, her voice tight. "Tell me what is happening, right now, or I will call the police." "You could," he said calmly. "But they would not believe you, and even if they did, they could not protect you the way my people can." "Protect me from what? I don't even know your name." "Kian," he said, and something about hearing it felt like a small gift he had chosen to give her, a piece of himself offered freely after a night of mystery. "My name is Kian Voss, and I promise you, Elena, none of this is coincidence, and none of it is a mistake." "Then what is it?" There was a pause, brief but heavy, before he answered. "It is the beginning of a story you were always meant to be part of. I know that sounds impossible. I know you have every reason to be afraid. But Freya will not hurt you. She will only bring you somewhere safe, somewhere I can explain everything properly, face to face, rather than through a phone line that cannot carry the weight of what I need to tell you." Elena closed her eyes, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Every rational part of her screamed that this was madness, that no sane person opened their door to strangers because of a feeling, a voice, a coincidence too strange to explain. And yet beneath the fear, something else stirred, something quieter and harder to name, a pull she could not dismiss, no matter how firmly she tried. "If I go with them," she said slowly, "and anything happens to me, you will regret it." "If anything happens to you," Kian answered, his voice suddenly low and fierce in a way that startled her, "the world will regret it long before I do." The intensity in his words left her breathless. She ended the call without responding, her hands trembling as she set the phone down. She stood, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward her front door, each step slower than the last, until her fingers finally closed around the lock. Whatever waited on the other side, she told herself, could not be worse than a lifetime of wondering what she had missed by staying hidden behind a locked door. She turned the handle and pulled it open, and the tall woman named Freya stood there, silver emblem gleaming faintly in the morning light, waiting with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind, simply patient, as though she had known all along that Elena would eventually choose to step outside. "You made the right choice," Freya said quietly. "I have not chosen anything yet," Elena replied. "I only opened a door." Freya's mouth curved, just slightly, into something that was almost a smile. "In my experience, Miss Marsh, opening a door is where every real choice begins." Behind Freya, two more figures stood at the top of the stairwell, silent and watchful, their eyes moving over Elena with an attentiveness that felt less like suspicion and more like awe, as though she were something rare they had traveled a long way to see. Elena did not understand it, not yet, but she felt it all the same, a weight of expectation settling onto her shoulders that had nothing to do with anything she had done, and everything to do with something she apparently was, without ever having known it herself. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," Freya said. "Somewhere that will make sense of everything, if you let it." Elena looked back once at her small apartment, at the life she had built quietly and without complaint, and then she stepped forward into the hallway, letting the door close softly behind her, uncertain if she was walking toward an answer, or simply further into the question that had begun the moment she dialed a wrong number in the dark. The back seat of the vehicle smelled of leather and something faintly herbal, like pine needles crushed underfoot. Elena sat rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the city slide past the tinted windows, as Freya sat across from her, calm and upright, offering no explanation beyond what she had already given. The silence between them stretched long enough that Elena finally broke it herself. "You said someone spoke with me last night," she said. "Kian, does he do this often? Send cars for strangers who dial the wrong number?" "No," Freya answered simply. "In all my years serving him, this has never happened before." "Then why me?" Freya studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much truth Elena could hold without breaking. "That is his story to tell, not mine. I would only get the details wrong, and he would not thank me for that. Elena turned back to the window, frustration and fear tangled together in her chest. The city gave way slowly to open road, tall buildings shrinking into distant lines on the horizon, replaced by hills covered in dense green forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. She had lived in this region her entire life, and had never once ventured this far from the roads she knew. And something about the unfamiliar landscape made her stomach tighten with unease. "How much further?" she asked. "Not long now," Freya said. "You will see the gates soon." True to her word, within 20 minutes the vehicle slowed, as it approached a set of iron gates set into a high stone wall, the same silver wolf emblem worked into the metalwork above the entrance. 2 guards flanked the gate, nodding once as the car passed through without stopping, as though its arrival had been expected down to the exact minute. Beyond the gates, a long gravel drive wound through manicured grounds, past gardens in careful bloom, and fountains that caught the morning light in scattered droplets, until finally, the estate itself came into view. It was not what Elena had expected. She had imagined something modern and severe, all glass and steel, the kind of building that matched the sleek cars and tailored suits. Instead, the estate looked almost timeless, built from pale gray stone with tall windows and ivy climbing one entire wing, more like a place from an old photograph than anything belonging to the present day. It felt as though it had stood in this exact spot for centuries, patient and unshaken by whatever changes had swept through the world beyond its walls. The car came to a stop at the base of a wide stone staircase, and Freya stepped out first, holding the door for Elena, with a courtesy that felt strangely formal given the circumstances. Elena climbed out slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her, and looked up at the building towering above them. "He is waiting inside," Freya said. "Come." They climbed the stairs together, passing beneath an archway carved with symbols Elena did not recognize, patterns that looked like a mixture of ancient script and something almost animal, claws or paw prints worked into stone borders. Inside, the entrance hall opened into a vast space with high ceilings and dark wood paneling, portraits lining the walls, dozens of faces stretching back through what looked like generations, all captured with the same intensity in their eyes, the same watchful quality that Elena had noticed in Freya and the others from the moment she stepped outside her apartment. A young man passed them in the hallway, offering a brief bow of his head toward Freya, before his gaze landed on Elena and lingered there, his expression shifting into something like disbelief mixed with wonder. He said nothing, but the reaction unsettled her more than words might have. "Why does everyone look at me like that?" Elena asked quietly. "Like what?" Freya said, though something in her voice suggested she understood the question perfectly well. "Like I'm something they've been waiting for." Freya did not answer immediately. They walked in silence past several more rooms, each one glimpsed briefly through open doors. Libraries filled floor to ceiling with old books, a dining hall large enough to seat perhaps 50 people, a sitting room with a fireplace tall enough for Elena to stand inside. Finally, they reached a set of double doors at the end of the corridor, carved with the same wolf emblem that seemed to mark every corner of this place. "Because," Freya finally said, her hand resting on the door handle, "that is exactly what you are." She pushed the doors open before Elena could ask what that meant, revealing a large study bathed in soft morning light, bookshelves rising to the ceiling on every wall, a large wooden desk positioned near tall windows that overlooked the gardens below. And standing near those windows, his back turned toward the door, was a man Elena recognized instantly despite never having seen his face, simply from the way her chest tightened at the sight of him, the same pull she had felt through the phone line the night before, only stronger now, almost overwhelming in its intensity. He turned slowly, and Elena found herself staring into eyes the color of storm clouds, pale gray shot through with flecks of silver, set in a face that was striking rather than conventionally handsome, sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw softened only slightly by the careful way he studied her, as though she might vanish if he moved too quickly. "Elena," he said, and hearing her name in person, spoken with that same deep voice she had memorized without meaning to, sent a shiver through her entire body. "You're real," she said, immediately feeling foolish for the words, though nothing about this morning had left much room for dignity. "I'm real," he agreed, a faint smile touching his mouth. "And so, I promise you, is everything I am about to tell you, however difficult it may be to believe." Freya excused herself quietly, closing the doors behind her, leaving Elena alone with the man who called himself Kian Voss, in a room filled with centuries of history she knew nothing about, standing at the very edge of a truth that would soon rewrite everything she thought she understood about her own ordinary life. "Please," Kian said, gesturing toward a pair of chairs near the fireplace. "Sit. There is a great deal to explain, and very little time in which to explain it." "Little time?" Elena repeated, unease creeping back into her voice as she lowered herself into the offered chair. "Why is time a problem?" Kian took the seat across from her, his gray eyes steady and serious. "Because the moment word spreads that I have found you, Elena, there will be those who wish to take you from me, before you even understand what you are to me. And I would rather you hear the truth from my own mouth than learn it in the middle of danger you never asked for." Elena's hands tightened in her lap. "Then tell me everything." Kian studied her for a long moment, as if gathering the courage for words he had perhaps never spoken aloud to anyone outside his own world. Then he began. "What I am about to say will sound like something from a story, told to frighten children, or perhaps to comfort them, depending on how it is told. But I assure you, every word is true. My family, my people, the ones you saw this morning wearing silver at their collars, we are not entirely human. We carry something older within us, something passed down through blood, for longer than written history can properly record." Elena felt a strange calm settle over her, the kind that sometimes arrives just before the full weight of something impossible finally lands. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Kian answered quietly, "that beneath this skin, beneath this face, you find familiar, there lives a wolf, as old as the forests surrounding this estate. And once a month, beneath a full moon, that wolf takes its true shape." Elena stared at him, waiting for some sign that this was an elaborate joke, some flicker in his expression that would reveal the truth, as an unusual test rather than a genuine claim. But Kian's face held nothing but calm sincerity, the same steadiness she had heard in his voice through the phone the night before. And slowly, impossibly, she found herself believing him, not because the words made sense, but because some part of her, some quiet instinct she could not name, recognized truth in them anyway. "Show me," she said, surprising herself with the boldness of the request. Kian's eyes softened, something like relief passing over his features, as though he had expected far more resistance than this. "Not here. Not now. The change requires the moon at its fullest, and that is still several nights away. But I can show you something else, something smaller, if it would ease your mind." He extended his hand toward her, palm upward, and Elena watched in stunned silence as the shape of his fingers shifted, nails lengthening into something closer to claws, dark and curved, before smoothly retracting back into ordinary human fingertips within the span of a single breath. It happened so quickly she might have doubted her own eyes, except that the sight left a lingering tingle across her skin, an awareness that something ancient and powerful lived just beneath the surface of the calm man sitting across from her. "I believe you," she whispered, though her voice shook slightly with the admission. "Good," Kian said, "because what I must tell you next matters far more than proving what I am." He leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes intent on hers. "Among my people, there exists a bond called a fated mate. It is rare, rarer than most of my kind will ever experience in an entire lifetime. When it happens, it cannot be chosen or forced. It simply arrives, sudden and undeniable, marked by recognition that defies explanation. The moment you spoke your name to me last night, Elena, I felt it. A pull unlike anything I have known in over 3 decades of life. My wolf recognized you before my mind had even finished processing the sound of your voice." Kian continued, his voice growing more reflective as he settled deeper into the chair across from her. "My family has led this territory for 11 generations, Elena. My ancestors built this estate stone by stone, choosing this location specifically for its distance from human settlements, back when secrecy meant survival rather than simple preference. Over centuries, we learned to coexist quietly alongside the world you know, stepping forward only when necessary, retreating into shadow the rest of the time. And this fated bond," Elena said slowly, "has it happened before, in your family's history?" "Rarely," Kian admitted. "My grandfather experienced it once, decades ago, though the woman he recognized as his mate died young. before their bond could fully mature. He spoke of her only occasionally throughout my childhood, always with a kind of quiet reverence that I did not fully understand until last night, when I heard your voice for the first time, and felt something shift permanently within me. Elena's breath caught. That's why you sent people to find me. Because of some old belief about fate. Not belief, Kian said gently. Certainty. My kind does not question this bond once it reveals itself, because to do so would be to deny the very nature written into our blood. And I did not simply send people to find you, Elena. I sent people to protect you, because the moment word spreads of what has happened between us, there are others who will see you not as a person, but as a weakness they can exploit. What kind of others? Kian's jaw tightened, the first sign of true tension she had seen since entering the room. Rival packs. Alphas who would see my bond to you as an opportunity to strike against me, to take from me the one thing capable of making me vulnerable in ways nothing else ever has. Chief among them is a man named Draven, leader of a pack to the north, who has wanted to see my authority broken for longer than I care to admit. Elena's hands curled into fists in her lap, fear finally breaking through the strange calm that had carried her this far. So you're telling me that just by existing, just by being connected to you somehow, I'm already in danger? Yes, Kian said, no hesitation in his answer, no attempt to soften the truth for her comfort. And I would rather you know that clearly now, from me, than discover it later, in a moment when I might not be quick enough to stand between you and whatever comes. The weight of his words settled over the room like a held breath. Elena thought of her apartment, her sister Nora, the ordinary life she had left behind that very morning, without fully understanding what she was walking away from. She thought of the exhaustion in her own voice the night before, confessed freely to a stranger who had turned out to be something far more complicated and far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Why are you telling me all of this, instead of simply keeping me safe without explanation? She asked. You could have lied. You could have made up some easier story. I could have, Kian admitted. But you deserve the truth, however frightening it may be, and I refuse to be the kind of man who builds anything with you, even safety, on a foundation of lies. Something in his voice, some quiet conviction beneath the danger and the strangeness of everything he had revealed, reached toward the exhausted, careful part of Elena that had spent years protecting herself from disappointment. She did not fully trust him yet, not completely, but she found herself wanting to, and that alone frightened her nearly as much as the idea of rival packs and ancient bonds. A sharp knock interrupted the quiet between them. Freya stepped back into the room without waiting for permission, her expression tighter than before, urgency replacing the calm composure she had carried earlier that morning. Forgive the interruption, she said, but you need to hear this immediately. Kian rose from his chair at once, his entire posture shifting into something alert and commanding. What has happened? Freya's eyes flicked briefly toward Elena, before returning to Kian, her voice low and controlled, despite the clear tension underneath it. Word has already reached the northern pack. Draven knows you have found your mate, and our scouts report movement along the border less than 3 hours from now. Kian's expression darkened, the calm scholar Elena had spoken with moments before, replaced by something harder, something that reminded her, quite suddenly, of exactly what he had claimed to be. Then we have far less time than I hoped, he said quietly, before turning back to Elena with eyes that carried both apology and fierce determination in equal measure. I am sorry, Elena, truly. I wanted to give you time to adjust before the danger became real. It seems fate has other plans. Elena stood before she had fully decided to, her legs carrying her upright on instinct alone. What does that mean? Movement along the border. Are they coming here? Not yet, Freya answered, before Kian could speak. But scouts report at least a dozen of Draven's people moving through the eastern woods, closer to the estate than any patrol he has sent in years. This is not subtle. He wants us to know he is watching. Gather the guard, Kian said, his voice sharpening into something commanding, a tone Elena had not yet heard from him. Double the watch at every gate. I want Callum informed the moment he wakes, and I want the perimeter sealed within the hour. Freya nodded once, and disappeared through the doors, leaving Elena standing in the center of the study, her heart hammering against her ribs, as the full weight of the morning pressed down on her all at once. She had woken less than 3 hours ago to strangers outside her apartment, And now she stood inside a stranger's home, being told that armed men were moving through nearby woods because of her. "I need air," she said quietly, though even as the words left her mouth, she was uncertain whether she meant it literally or simply needed distance from the intensity radiating off Kian. "Of course," he said gently, guiding her toward a set of glass doors that opened onto a wide stone terrace overlooking the gardens. The morning had grown warmer, sunlight now fully clearing the tree line, birds moving between hedges, as though the world beyond this estate had no knowledge of the danger, apparently closing in around it. Elena gripped the stone railing, breathing slowly, trying to steady the tremor that had settled into her hands. "This is insane," she said, half to herself. "Yesterday, my biggest problem was a leaking faucet." "I know this is overwhelming," Kian said, standing a careful distance away, giving her space even as concern deepened the lines around his eyes. "I would give anything to make this simpler for you, but I cannot change what I am, and I cannot change what you now mean to me, however sudden and unfair that feels." "Do I have a choice in any of this?" Elena asked, turning to face him fully. "You keep speaking about fate, about bonds neither of us chose. But what about what I want? Nobody has asked me that yet." Kian's expression shifted, something like respect flickering behind the concern. "You always have a choice, Elena. The bond may have chosen us, but nothing forces you to accept anything beyond it. If you wish to leave this estate, to return to your life and never see me again, I will arrange it myself, and I will ensure Draven's people never learn enough about you to make you a target." The offer hung in the air between them, sincere as far as Elena could tell, and for a moment she genuinely considered it, pictured herself back in her small apartment, faucet still leaking, ordinary problems waiting patiently for her return. But something held her in place, some thread she could not quite name, woven from the honesty in his voice, the memory of how safe she had felt, confessing her exhaustion to a stranger in the dark, and the strange, undeniable pull that had followed her from that phone call into this garden. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted, "but I know I don't want to run without understanding what I'm running from." Kian nodded slowly, as though her answer, uncertain as it was, satisfied something within him regardless. "Then let me show you enough to understand, so that whatever you choose it with open eyes." Before he could continue, a low horn sounded somewhere beyond the garden walls, 3 short blasts that echoed across the estate grounds, and Elena watched every guard visible from the terrace snap into immediate motion, hands moving toward weapons hidden beneath their tailored jackets, eyes scanning the tree line with sudden, sharp focus. "That's the perimeter alert," Kian said, his entire body going rigid beside her. "Someone has crossed the outer boundary." A young man burst through the garden doors moments later, breathless, his dark hair disheveled, as though he had run the entire distance from wherever he had been posted. He bowed his head briefly toward Kian before speaking, his eyes darting nervously toward Elena. "Alpha. 3 of Draven's scouts breached the eastern fence line. Our patrol intercepted them before they reached the tree line near the house, but 2 others slipped past toward the northern wall." "Casualties?" Kian asked sharply. "None yet, but they're still moving. Callum has already mobilized a response team." Kian turned to Elena, his expression torn between the urgency of the moment and clear reluctance to leave her unprotected, even for a few minutes. "I need to go. Freya will stay with you, and I promise you will be safe inside these walls, but I cannot delay." "Go," Elena said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded, despite the fear tightening every muscle in her body. "I'll be fine." Kian hesitated only a moment longer, his gray eyes searching hers as though memorizing the sight of her standing there, safe for now, before he turned and moved swiftly through the garden doors, the young messenger falling into step behind him. Elena watched him go, her hands still gripping the stone railing, the sudden absence of his presence leaving the terrace colder than it had felt only moments before. Freya appeared beside her within seconds, her posture alert, eyes constantly scanning the tree line beyond the garden walls even as she spoke.
"Come inside, Miss Marsh."
"It is safer away from open ground until this settles." Elena allowed herself to be guided back into the study, though her mind remained fixed on the image of Kian moving toward danger without hesitation, the same man who only minutes before had spoken so gently about choice and fate and the fear he carried for her safety. She sat down slowly in the same chair from before, her hands finally beginning to steady, though her thoughts raced faster than ever. "Does this happen often?" she asked Freya, who stood near the window, watching the grounds with unwavering focus. "Scouts breaching the fence like this?" "Not this close," Freya admitted. "Not in the years I have served him. Draven grows bolder each season, testing our defenses, searching for weakness. But he has never sent anyone this near the house itself, not until this morning." "Because of me," Elena said quietly. Freya turned to look at her fully, for the first time since returning to the room, something unreadable passing behind her sharp eyes. "Because of the bond, yes. Word travels fast among our kind, faster than you might imagine, and a fated mate is not a secret that stays hidden for long, however quietly we might wish to keep it." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, the reality of her situation settling heavier with every passing minute. Less than a day ago she had been an anonymous paralegal drowning quietly in unpaid overtime, and now she sat inside a centuries-old estate, while armed men searched nearby woods for intruders, sent specifically because of her unexpected existence in Kian Voss's life. Outside, the horn sounded twice more in quick succession, and Freya's entire body tensed at the sound, her hand moving instinctively toward the weapon Elena only now noticed hidden beneath her jacket. "What does that mean?" Elena asked, dread pooling low in her stomach. Freya's jaw tightened before she answered, her voice quieter than before, though no less urgent. "It means they found them, the scouts who slipped past the northern wall, and they were not alone." Elena rose to her feet without meaning to, every instinct urging her toward the window, toward some vantage point that might tell her what was happening beyond the garden walls. Freya moved quickly to block her path, her expression firm despite the sympathy visible underneath it. "Stay back from the glass," Freya instructed. "It is reinforced, but there is no reason to test how thoroughly." "Tell me what's happening," Elena demanded. "Please. I can't just sit here not knowing." Freya studied her for a long moment, weighing something behind her sharp eyes, before finally answering. "A larger group crossed near the northern wall, while our attention remained fixed on the eastern breach. It appears the first scouts were a distraction, meant to draw our forces away from the true point of entry." "That sounds deliberate, planned." "It was," Freya said grimly. "Draven does not waste resources on careless attempts. If he sent people this far onto our land, it was to test exactly how quickly we would notice, and exactly how far he could push before real consequences followed." A distant sound reached them then, faint through the thick walls of the estate, something that might have been raised voices or perhaps something closer to a low, rolling growl carried on the wind. Elena's skin prickled at the sound, some ancient part of her recognizing danger, even though her mind could not fully process what she was hearing. "Is that them?" she whispered. "Is that Kian?" Freya's expression remained carefully neutral, though her hand had not left the weapon at her side since the horn sounded. "It could be several people. Our guards are trained to handle intrusions like this. This is far from the first time our borders have been tested." Minutes stretched by in tense silence, each one feeling longer than the last, until finally the study doors opened again, and Kian stepped through, his shirt torn slightly at one shoulder, a shallow scratch visible along his jaw that had not been there before he left. Elena's breath caught at the sight of him, relief and fear tangling together so tightly she could not separate one from the other. "You're hurt," she said, moving toward him before she could stop herself. "It's nothing," Kian said, though he did not step away from her approach, allowing her to reach up and touch the edge of the scratch with careful fingers, an intimacy neither of them had shared before that moment, born entirely from the fear of what might have happened, rather than any planned closeness between them. "What happened out there?" Freya asked, her voice all business despite the visible relief in her posture at seeing him return. Kian exhaled slowly, some of the tension easing from his shoulders now that the immediate danger had passed. They moved faster than expected, cutting through the hedges near the greenhouse rather than following the paths our guards typically watch. One nearly slipped past entirely, before Callum's team cornered him against the garden wall. "And the scratch?" Elena asked, still tracing her fingers lightly near his jaw. "A minor disagreement," Kian said, the faintest hint of dry humor breaking through his otherwise serious tone. "He fought harder than most scouts typically do once cornered, though he was no match for three of us working together. It cost him more than it cost me, I assure you." "We caught two of them near the northern greenhouse," Kian continued, addressing Freya directly now, his gray eyes hard with restrained anger. They carried tracking devices, small enough to hide easily, clearly meant to mark this location for a larger force to follow later. Did they talk? Freya pressed. Enough, Kian answered grimly. Draven sent them specifically to confirm the bond, to verify that the rumors reaching his territory were true, before he commits anything larger. Now that his people have seen Elena's presence here with their own eyes, there is no more room for doubt on his end. Elena's stomach twisted painfully. They saw me? Kian's expression softened slightly as he looked at her, though the underlying tension never fully left his features. Briefly, through a window before our guards intercepted them. I am sorry, Elena. I wish I could tell you this changes nothing, but it would be a lie, and I promised you honesty above all else. So what happens now? Elena asked, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coiling tighter in her chest. Kian glanced toward Freya, some silent communication passing between them before he answered. Now we prepare properly, rather than reacting piece by piece to whatever Draven sends next. I will call together my closest circle, including Callum, my second in command, and we will discuss how best to protect this estate, and more importantly, how best to protect you. I don't want to just be protected, Elena said, surprising herself again with the firmness in her own voice. I want to understand what's happening, well enough to help, not just hide inside walls, while everyone else fights over something that started because of me. Something shifted in Kian's expression, a flicker of admiration breaking through the tension, though concern remained close behind it. You are remarkable, Elena, and braver than most people I have known in my long life. But you must understand, this world moves by rules and dangers you have only just begun to glimpse. Give yourself time before insisting on a role in a fight this dangerous. You didn't hesitate to walk toward danger yourself just now, Elena pointed out. Why should I be any different? Kian opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the study doors opened once more, and a tall man entered, broad-shouldered and dark-haired, his expression sharp and alert, as his eyes moved immediately toward Kian, then toward Elena, lingering there with an intensity that mirrored every other reaction she had received since arriving at this estate. Alpha, the man said, bowing his head briefly. Forgive the interruption, but you need to see this immediately. Callum, Kian said, straightening at once. What is it? Callum's gaze flicked once more toward Elena before he answered, his voice low and urgent. A message arrived at the front gate less than 5 minutes ago. No courier, no vehicle, simply left tied to the gate itself for our guards to find. A message from whom? Freya asked sharply, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Callum held out a folded piece of parchment, the edges slightly worn, sealed with a wax stamp bearing an emblem Elena did not recognize. Dark and jagged where the wolf symbol throughout Kian's estate was silver and refined. Kian took it slowly, breaking the seal with visible tension in his fingers, unfolding the parchment to read whatever message waited inside. His expression darkened further with every line, his jaw tightening, until Elena could see the muscle working beneath his skin, some barely restrained fury simmering just below the surface of his calm exterior. What does it say? Elena asked quietly, dread settling deep and cold in her stomach. Kian looked up from the parchment, his gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that carried both apology and warning in equal measure. Draven has issued a formal challenge, he said. He demands a meeting between our packs within 3 days, at neutral ground along the northern border, and he has made his terms very clear. Either I surrender claim to you, Elena, or he will take you from me by force, and he does not intend to be gentle about how he accomplishes either outcome. Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she remained standing, gripping the back of the nearest chair for support. 3 days. A stranger she had never met, a man named Draven who apparently commanded an entire pack of his own, had already decided her fate belonged to him or to Kian, with no consideration given to what she herself might want. He can't just decide that, she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to steady it. I'm not property to be handed over or fought over. No, Kian agreed immediately, folding the parchment with controlled precision, as though the physical act of closing it might contain some of the anger clearly building within him. You are not, but Draven does not see the world the way I do, Elena. To him, this is a matter of territory and power, Nothing more. And he will use any opportunity, including you, to weaken my position among the packs. Then refuse, Elena said. Tell him no. Callum shifted uncomfortably near the doorway, exchanging a brief glance with Freya before speaking carefully. It is not so simple, Miss Marsh. A formal challenge, once issued and acknowledged, cannot be ignored without consequence. If Kian refuses to respond, Draven will claim the right to act unilaterally, and our alliance with the neighboring packs will not intervene on our behalf unless the challenge is properly answered. So the rules of your world force you to negotiate with someone threatening to kidnap me, Elena said flatly. Essentially, yes, Kian admitted, frustration evident in the tight line of his shoulders. Though negotiate is too gentle a word for what Draven intends, he does not offer terms expecting acceptance. He offers them expecting refusal, so that he has justification to act with force under the guise of following tradition. Elena sank back into the chair, her mind racing through everything she had learned in the span of a single morning. Wolves, and fated bonds and rival packs, and now formal challenges carrying the threat of violence dressed up in old traditions she barely understood. She thought of her apartment again, her ordinary life, waiting patiently behind a locked door she had walked away from only hours ago, and for a brief, exhausted moment, she wondered if leaving now, before anything worse happened, might still be possible. But then she thought of Kian's hand shifting briefly into something not quite human, the honesty in his voice when he admitted the danger rather than hiding it from her, the way he had walked directly toward armed intruders without hesitation to protect people who depended on him. Running now would not undo what had already happened. Draven's people had already seen her. The bond, whatever it truly was, already existed whether she accepted it or not. What happens at this meeting? She asked slowly. If you go and refuse to hand me over. Kian's expression grew serious, gray eyes steady on hers. Then Draven will likely challenge me directly, pack against pack, or in some cases, alpha against alpha, in single combat, depending on the traditions he chooses to invoke. Either way, blood is likely to be shed before this ends, regardless of what choice I make regarding you. Then it isn't really a choice at all, Elena said quietly. Whatever happens, someone gets hurt because of me. Not because of you, Kian said firmly, moving closer, and kneeling slightly, so his eyes remained level with hers. Because of Draven's ambition, and because of a world that decided long before either of us existed, that power matters more than kindness to men like him. None of this is your doing, Elena. I need you to understand that clearly, whatever else you come to believe about your place in this. Elena studied his face, searching for any hint of deception, any sign that his words were simply meant to comfort rather than reflect genuine belief. She found none. Whatever else remained uncertain about this strange new world she had stumbled into, Kian's sincerity felt like the one solid thing she could hold on to. Then let me help, she said, not by hiding, not by being handed back and forth like some prize in your rivalry with this man. Let me actually understand what I'm facing, so I can make my own choices about how to face it. Callum spoke up from the doorway, his tone thoughtful rather than dismissive. Alpha, she may have a point. Draven's people saw her only briefly. If we prepare her properly, teach her enough about our customs and our defenses, she becomes less of a liability and more of an asset, particularly if negotiations require her presence. Freya nodded slowly in agreement, though her expression remained cautious. It is unconventional, but not unheard of. Some fated mates in the old records took active roles in resolving conflicts like this one, rather than remaining passive throughout. Kian looked between his two most trusted advisors, then back to Elena, something like reluctant pride mixing with his obvious worry. You are certain this is what you want. Once you step further into this world, there is no simple path back to the life you left behind this morning. I understood that the moment I opened my apartment door, Elena said, I would rather walk forward with my eyes open than be protected into ignorance. A faint smile touched the corner of Kian's mouth, brief but genuine. Then we begin immediately. Callum, gather what records we have regarding Draven's territory and his known allies. Freya, I want the estate's defenses reviewed personally before nightfall. And Elena, he turned back to her, gray eyes intent, you will need to learn quickly, about us, about our history, and about exactly what kind of man you are preparing to face in 3 days. Before the larger group dispersed to their various tasks, Freya pulled Elena briefly aside, near the study's tall windows, her sharp eyes studying her with new consideration. If you intend to stand at that border in 3 days, you should understand more than history alone. You should understand something of how we carry ourselves, how we read a room full of people who are not entirely human. What do you mean? Elena asked. Posture, Freya said simply. Confidence, even manufactured confidence, reads differently to us than it does among your own kind. Draven's people will watch you closely, searching for weakness, for any sign of fear they can use against Kian later. I can teach you to stand in a way that gives them less to find. Elena considered the offer, understanding immediately how valuable such guidance might prove, given everything ahead of her. Show me. Freya spent nearly 20 minutes correcting the smallest details of Elena's stance, the angle of her shoulders, the steadiness of her gaze. Small adjustments that felt awkward and unnatural at first but gradually settled into something that did, indeed, feel sturdier, more grounded, as though the posture itself lent her a measure of the calm she was struggling to feel internally. Better, Freya said finally, stepping back to assess her work. Remember, fear is not the enemy here. Everyone feels fear facing something like this. The enemy is allowing that fear to show plainly enough that others can use it against you. Thank you, Elena said, genuinely grateful for the small kindness amid everything else demanding her attention, for treating me like someone worth training, rather than simply someone to be protected. Freya's expression softened slightly, an unusual warmth breaking through her typically composed demeanor. You have already shown more courage than most humans would manage in your position, Miss Marsh. Training simply sharpens what already exists within you. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of information Elena struggled to absorb even as she forced herself to focus, seated at the long table in the estate's library, while Kian and Freya took turns explaining centuries of history, compressed into hours. The origins of the packs, the delicate balance of power maintained between different territories, and the specific reputation Draven had built over decades as a leader who respected strength above all else, and viewed compassion as a weakness to be exploited rather than admired. Freya explained the old customs surrounding territory disputes, how boundaries had been drawn generations earlier through careful negotiation rather than conquest, and how fragile that peace remained even now, dependent entirely on each alpha honoring agreements their ancestors had sworn to uphold. Kian added detail where he could, describing specific encounters with Draven over the years, small provocations that had never quite escalated into open conflict until now, each one testing the boundaries of patience a little further than the last. He has always resented my position, Kian explained, tracing a line on the map that marked the long boundary between their territories. My family holds more influence among the surrounding packs than his ever has, despite his territory being nearly equal in size. He believes that influence should belong to him instead, and he has spent years searching for any opportunity to prove himself the stronger claim. And now he thinks he's found one, Elena said. Through me. Through circumstances he could never have engineered himself, Kian corrected gently, which perhaps makes it more dangerous, in his mind. He views this as fate, handing him exactly the opportunity he has always wanted, a genuine weakness, rather than one he manufactured through his own scheming. By evening, Elena's head ached with new names and unfamiliar customs, yet beneath the exhaustion, something had shifted within her, a quiet resolve settling into place, where fear had dominated only hours before. She was no longer simply a woman, swept along by circumstances beyond her control. She was beginning, slowly and deliberately, to understand the world she now stood within, and with that understanding came the first flickers of genuine determination to face whatever came next, rather than simply endure it. As night fell over the estate, Kian found her alone on the terrace, staring out at the darkening tree line where, somewhere beyond sight, Draven's people continued watching, waiting for the 3 days to pass. You should rest, he said softly, joining her at the railing. Tomorrow brings more preparation, and you will need your strength. I keep thinking about the phone call, Elena admitted. How strange it is that one wrong number led to all of this. Do you regret answering? Kian turned to look at her fully, moonlight catching the silver flecks in his gray eyes. Not for a single moment. Whatever danger has followed, whatever difficulty still waits ahead of us, I would answer that call again 1,000 times over, simply for the chance to have found you. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest, despite the cold night air, a feeling she had not expected to discover this quickly, in the middle of danger and uncertainty. But before she could respond, a soft chime sounded from Kian's jacket pocket, and his expression shifted instantly, warmth replaced by sharp alertness, as he retrieved his phone and read whatever message had just arrived. "What is it?" Elena asked, dread returning swiftly at the sight of his darkening expression. Kian looked up slowly, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Draven has moved the meeting. He no longer intends to wait 3 days. He has demanded we appear at the northern border by dawn tomorrow, or he will consider his challenge forfeited by default, granting him full justification to attack this estate directly. Elena's heart dropped. That's less than 12 hours from now. Yes, Kian said grimly, already turning toward the estate doors, his voice carrying an urgency that left no room for further comfort or preparation. Which means whatever readiness we hope to build over 3 days, we must now accomplish in a single night. The estate transformed within minutes, quiet halls suddenly filled with hurried footsteps and low, urgent conversation, as Kian's people mobilized around the sudden change in timeline. Elena followed him through corridors she had only just begun to learn her way through, watching guards check weapons and communication devices with practiced efficiency, their earlier calm replaced by focused determination. Callum met them near the main hall, a thick folder of documents tucked under one arm, his expression grim. "Alpha, I have gathered what intelligence we possess on Draven's likely approach, but with the timeline moved this drastically, much of it may already be outdated. Work with what we have," Kian said. "Better an imperfect plan tonight than a perfect one arriving too late tomorrow." They gathered in the library, the same long table where Elena had spent hours absorbing history, now covered instead with maps of the northern border region, small markers indicating known positions of Draven's forces alongside estimated numbers and capabilities. Elena leaned over the table alongside Freya and Callum, forcing herself to focus despite the exhaustion pulling at her mind, determined to understand enough to be useful, rather than simply another concern Kian had to manage during a crisis. "Why would he move the timeline up so suddenly?" Elena asked, studying the map. "What does he gain by rushing this?" "Advantage," Freya answered immediately. "The shorter the preparation window, the more likely mistakes occur. Draven understands that Kian would use 3 full days to strengthen every possible weakness. By cutting that time down to hours, he forces us into decisions made under pressure rather than careful strategy." "Then we need to think faster than he expects," Elena said, an idea forming slowly as she studied the northern border markers. "What if the meeting itself isn't actually where the real danger lies? What if he's using the deadline as a distraction, the same way his scouts used the eastern breach to hide the northern approach this morning?" Kian looked up sharply from the map, exchanging a glance with Callum before turning his full attention to Elena. "Explain what you mean." "You said yourself that Draven respects strength and views patience as weakness," Elena continued, gaining confidence as the thought solidified. "A rushed deadline sounds less like genuine urgency and more like a tactic meant to keep your attention fixed entirely on the northern border, exactly where he wants you looking, while something else happens somewhere you aren't watching closely." Callum's expression shifted from skepticism to careful consideration. "It is possible. Draven has used misdirection before, though rarely on this scale. If she is right," Freya said slowly, "then sending our full guard to the northern border tomorrow could leave the estate itself dangerously undermanned." Kian's jaw tightened as he studied the map, tracing possible routes with one finger, weighing Elena's theory against everything he already knew about his rival. "It is a risk either way. If we split our forces, and I am wrong about the estate being a secondary target, we weaken our position at the border unnecessarily. But if Elena is correct and we ignore the possibility, we may return from the border to find everything we sought to protect already lost." "What if we split the difference?" Callum suggested. "A smaller, highly capable team remains here at the estate, under my direct command, while you and the larger guard proceed to the border as expected. If Draven does attempt something here, we will be ready. If not, we lose nothing by the added caution." Kian considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Do it. And Callum, choose carefully. If Elena's instincts prove correct, whoever remains here will face the true test of tonight, not those of us traveling north." Callum moved quickly to select his team, calling in names Elena did not yet recognize, guards known for steady nerves and quick thinking under pressure, rather than raw strength alone. He spread a second, smaller map across the table, marking specific points around the estate's perimeter, where a hidden force might reasonably attempt entry unnoticed. The southern woods offer the easiest cover, Callum said, tapping the map firmly. Dense enough to mask movement, close enough to reach the house within minutes, once inside the tree line. If I were planning a quiet strike while attention remained fixed elsewhere, that is where I would send my people. Then double the watch there specifically, Keon instructed, quietly. I don't want obvious reinforcement that might tip our hand if Draven has eyes watching the estate even now. Freya nodded, already making notes of her own. I'll have 2 additional guards stationed near the old well house by midnight, positioned to observe the southern tree line without revealing themselves easily. If anyone comes through that way, we'll know before they reach the walls. Elena studied the map herself, tracing the boundary lines with growing familiarity after hours spent absorbing the estate's layout. What about the greenhouse? It backs directly onto the woods there too, and it's far enough from the main house that a smaller team might overlook it. Callum's brow furrowed as he considered her observation. She's right. We focused so heavily on the direct approaches that we overlooked a structure that could serve as a staging point rather than a target itself. Add coverage there as well, Kian said. Better redundant caution than another gap in our defenses. The planning continued for hours, every possible approach and counter-approach discussed and debated, until Elena's eyes burned with fatigue, and her voice grew hoarse from the unfamiliar effort of contributing to strategy, far beyond anything her paralegal training had ever prepared her for. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something new had taken root, a sense that she was not merely being protected through this crisis, but actively shaping how it might unfold. Near midnight, as the final details of tomorrow's approach were settled, Elena noticed a young man standing near the library entrance, someone she had not seen before among Kian's inner circle, watching the proceedings with quiet, careful attention. When she caught his eye, he offered a polite nod before slipping quietly from the room, and something about his departure, too smooth, too unremarkable, left a faint unease she could not quite explain. Who was that? She asked Freya, once the young man had gone. Freya glanced toward the doorway, her expression unreadable. Gideon. He handles communications for the estate, coordinating between our scouts and the main house. He has served Kian faithfully for nearly 2 years now. He seemed to be listening very closely, Elena said. He often does, Freya replied simply. It is his job to know everything happening within these walls. Elena let the observation go, telling herself that exhaustion was making her suspicious of shadows that meant nothing, though the uneasy feeling lingered somewhere in the back of her mind, even as the meeting finally concluded, and Kian insisted she rest before the difficult hours that awaited them at dawn. She lay awake long after retiring to the quiet room prepared for her within the estate, staring at unfamiliar ceiling beams, while her mind replayed every detail of the day, the phone call, the silver wolves outside her apartment, Kian's gray eyes, and the gentle honesty in his voice, the parchment sealed with Draven's dark emblem, and finally, the quiet young man named Gideon, slipping unnoticed from a room full of secrets he perhaps understood better than anyone realized. Sleep found her eventually, shallow and restless, filled with half-formed images of moonlit forests and distant howls that seemed to carry warning rather than comfort. When dawn finally broke over the estate, gray light spilling through her window, Elena rose feeling as though she had barely slept at all, her body heavy with the weight of what the coming hours would demand, uncertain whether she would face this day standing beside Kian at the northern border, or whether the true danger, exactly as her instincts warned, waited far closer to home than either of them had prepared for. Kian insisted she remain at the estate while he traveled north, but Elena refused the moment he suggested it, standing firm in the front hall as the guard assembled around them in the pale early light. I understand the danger, she said, before he could argue further. But I refuse to sit inside these walls wondering what is happening to you, especially when Draven's people have already seen my face. Hiding me now accomplishes nothing except making me feel powerless, and I have had enough of feeling powerless these past 2 days. Kian studied her for a long moment, torn between his instinct to protect and his growing respect for her resolve. Finally he nodded once, though the tightness around his eyes revealed how little he liked the decision. Stay close to me at all times. Whatever happens at that border, I will not lose you the moment we finally found each other. The drive north took nearly 2 hours, the estate's grounds giving way to increasingly wild terrain, dense forest pressing close against narrow roads, until finally the vehicles slowed at the edge of a wide, open clearing, marked by an ancient stone marker half sunken into the earth, worn smooth by centuries of weather. This, Freya explained quietly, was the recognized boundary between territories, neutral ground respected by every pack for longer than written record could properly account for. Elena spent much of the drive rehearsing the posture Freya had taught her the night before, straightening her shoulders, steadying her breathing, willing her expression into something calm and unreadable despite the anxious churn building steadily in her stomach. Kian sat beside her in tense silence for most of the journey, his gaze fixed on the passing trees, though he reached for her hand once, halfway through the drive, holding it firmly without a word, as though the simple contact offered reassurance neither of them could easily express aloud. Whatever he says, Kian finally spoke as the vehicles began slowing near the clearing. Remember that his words are meant to provoke, not to inform. Draven negotiates through intimidation, because it has served him well against those who let their composure crack under pressure. I won't crack, Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her best effort. I know, Kian said softly, squeezing her hand once more, before releasing it, as the vehicle came to a full stop. You have proven that already, more times than I expected when this began. Draven's people were already waiting when they arrived, perhaps 20 strong, positioned in a loose formation across the clearing, their postures alert but not aggressive, the careful discipline of people who understood the weight of tradition, even while harboring intentions Elena suspected were far from peaceful. At the center of the group stood a man Elena immediately recognized as their leader, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair shot through with early gray, and an expression carved from cold, patient authority. Draven, Kian said as they approached, his voice carrying an edge of formal restraint that Elena had not heard from him before. Kian Voss, Draven replied, his gaze sliding immediately toward Elena, with an intensity that made her skin crawl, assessing her the way someone might assess property, rather than a person. So the rumors were true after all. I confess, I did not expect the great Alpha King to find his fated mate hiding among ordinary humans, dialing wrong numbers in the dark. You seem remarkably informed about the details of a private phone call, Kian said evenly, though Elena caught the subtle tension rippling through his shoulders at the comment. Draven smiled, thin and humorless. Information travels quickly when one knows where to listen, but we are not here to discuss the particulars of how your bond began. We are here to discuss what happens now that it exists. You issued a challenge, Kian said. State your terms plainly, as tradition requires, and I will answer them just as plainly. Draven's dark eyes moved once more to Elena before returning to Kian, something calculating flickering behind his composed expression. My terms remain unchanged from the message I sent. Surrender your claim to her, formally and before witnesses from both packs, and this conflict ends peacefully. Refuse, and I will consider it an act of aggression against my territory, justifying whatever response I deem necessary to secure what I believe should rightfully expand my own influence. You have no claim to her, Kian said, his voice low and dangerous now, the careful diplomat giving way to something fiercer beneath the surface. The bond chose her for me, not for you, and no tradition among our people grants you the right to demand otherwise. Traditions can be reinterpreted, Draven said smoothly, particularly when the alpha holding them refuses to acknowledge the shifting balance of power between our territories. I have grown patient, waiting for an opportunity to correct that balance, Kian. I do not intend to let this one pass, simply because you dislike my methods. Elena felt every eye in the clearing settle on her as the tension between the two alphas sharpened, and she realized, with sudden clarity, that remaining silent while these two men decided her future between them was no longer something she was willing to accept, regardless of how frightened she felt standing at the center of this ancient, dangerous negotiation. May I speak? She asked, her voice carrying further across the clearing than she expected, drawing surprised glances from both sides of the assembled packs. Draven's eyebrows lifted slightly, amusement flickering across his composed features. The human wishes to address the negotiation herself. How refreshingly unconventional. I am not property to be surrendered or claimed, Elena continued, ignoring the condescension in his tone, forcing steadiness into her voice despite her racing heart. Whatever bond exists between myself and Kian, it exists because of something neither of us controlled, not because of anything either of you can negotiate away through threats or old traditions bent to fit your ambitions. A bold statement, Draven said, though something colder entered his expression now, the amusement fading into genuine irritation at being addressed so directly. But bold words do not change the reality of your situation, Miss Marsh. You stand entirely unprotected by our laws, existing outside the traditions that would otherwise grant you any voice at all in matters like these. Then perhaps your traditions need to change, Elena said, because I do not intend to remain silent while my own life is discussed as though I were nothing more than territory to be divided. A murmur rippled through both assembled groups at her words, and Elena watched Kian's expression shift subtly beside her, something like fierce pride breaking through the careful diplomatic mask he had maintained since their arrival. Draven, however, showed no such softening, his dark eyes narrowing as he studied her with renewed, calculating interest. "Careful, little human," he said quietly, all trace of earlier amusement gone entirely from his voice. "Confidence is admirable, but it will not protect you from what comes if Kian proves too weak to hold what he claims as his." "Enough," Kian said sharply, stepping slightly in front of Elena, his entire posture shifting into something coiled and dangerous. "You have heard her answer, Draven, and you have heard mine. I will not surrender her, not now, not ever, regardless of what consequences you believe yourself entitled to enforce." Draven's expression hardened into something colder, more final, the last remnants of diplomatic patience draining visibly from his face. "Then I formally invoke the right of challenge, alpha against alpha, as our oldest traditions permit. Should you fall, Kian Voss, your claim to her dissolves entirely, and she becomes mine to protect, or to dispose of, exactly as I see fit." The clearing fell utterly silent, tension crackling through the cold morning air, like something physical, and Elena watched Kian's jaw tighten with fierce, unwavering resolve as he stepped forward to accept a challenge that would determine, in the span of a single fight, everything about the future she had only just begun to imagine for herself. "I accept," Kian said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing, final and unshakable. "Name the terms, Draven, and let us settle this here and now, rather than allow this tension to fester any longer than it already has." "Simple terms," Draven said, already removing his jacket and handing it to one of his people without breaking eye contact with Kian. "No weapons, no interference from either pack. First blood decides nothing. Only surrender or incapacitation ends this." Kian removed his own jacket, passing it to Freya, who accepted it with a tight, worried expression that betrayed far more concern than her usual composed demeanor allowed. Elena stepped closer to her, unable to tear her eyes away from the two men now facing each other across the clearing, every muscle in her body tense with a fear she could not fully voice. "Is this normal?" she whispered to Freya. "Alphas fighting like this?" "It happens," Freya answered quietly, "though rarely between packs of this size. Draven is strong, Miss Marsh. Kian is stronger, but strength alone does not guarantee victory in a fight like this." The two men circled each other slowly, the assembled packs forming a loose ring around the clearing, tension so thick Elena could feel it pressing against her skin like something physical. Then, without warning, Draven lunged forward, impossibly fast, and Elena gasped as Kian barely sidestepped the attack, retaliating with a strike that Draven blocked at the last possible second. What followed was unlike anything Elena had ever witnessed, closer to watching two forces of nature collide than any fight she might have imagined. Movements too quick for her eyes to fully track, strikes landing with impacts that echoed across the clearing like thunder. Both men bore visible marks within minutes, torn clothing and darkening bruises, yet neither showed any sign of slowing, their contest growing fiercer with every passing exchange. Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides, every instinct urging her to look away from the brutality unfolding before her, yet she found herself unable to tear her eyes from Kian, willing him silently toward victory with every fiber of her being. When Draven managed to land a solid blow that sent Kian stumbling backward, her heart lurched painfully, and she had to bite back a cry that rose unbidden in her throat. Kian recovered quickly, however, countering with a fierce combination that finally forced Draven onto the defensive, for the first time since the fight began. The Northern Alpha's earlier confidence flickered, replaced by something sharper, more desperate, as he realized the contest was slipping steadily away from him. It was in that moment, with Kian pressing his advantage and Draven visibly faltering, that a sudden commotion erupted at the edge of the clearing. A vehicle screeched to a halt along the narrow access road, and a young guard Elena recognized from the estate stumbled out, breathless and pale, sprinting toward Freya with obvious desperation. "Report," Freya demanded sharply, though her eyes remained fixed on the unfolding fight, even as she addressed the messenger. "The estate," the young man gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "We're under attack. A force came through the southern woods less than 20 minutes ago, far larger than anything Callum anticipated. He's requesting immediate reinforcement, but says he cannot guarantee the estate will hold much longer without it." Elena's blood ran cold. Her instincts from the night before, the theory she had voiced about misdirection and distraction, had proven correct after all, but the confirmation brought no satisfaction, only sharp, immediate terror. While Kian fought Draven here at the border, exactly as Draven intended, the true assault had been launched against the estate itself, likely coordinated by someone within Draven's ranks who remained deliberately absent from this clearing. "We need to warn Kian," Elena said urgently, though even as she spoke the words, she realized the impossibility of interrupting a fight this intense without risking catastrophic consequences for whoever attempted it. Freya's expression had gone hard and calculating, clearly weighing the same impossible choice. "If we call him away now, mid-fight, Draven will claim victory by forfeit, and everything Kian has fought for in this clearing becomes worthless. But if we don't warn him, the estate could fall before reinforcements arrive," Elena said, panic rising sharply in her chest. Across the clearing, oblivious to the news that had just arrived, Kian pressed his advantage further, finally forcing Draven to his knees, with a decisive strike that left the Northern Alpha gasping, clearly beaten, though not yet willing to formally concede. Kian stood over him, chest heaving, gray eyes blazing with fierce triumph that Elena knew would shatter the instant he learned what was happening back at the estate. "Yield," Kian demanded, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent clearing. Draven remained on his knees for a long, tense moment, breathing heavily, before finally raising his eyes to meet Kian's gaze, something cold and calculating flickering behind his defeat, despite the physical toll the fight had clearly taken. "I yield," he said, though his voice carried none of the humility the words should have implied. "You have won this contest fairly, Kian Voss. Your claim to her stands, according to the oldest traditions we both honor." But even as the words left his mouth, something in his expression, some faint, satisfied gleam buried beneath the exhaustion, told Elena that this victory, however genuine, might already be too late to matter, exactly as Draven had likely intended from the very beginning. Freya stepped forward immediately, unable to contain the urgency any longer. "Alpha, forgive the interruption, but you must hear this now. The estate is under attack." Kian's triumphant expression shattered instantly, replaced by cold, immediate dread as he turned toward Freya, his chest still heaving from the fight. "What? When?" "Nearly 20 minutes ago," Freya said quickly. "A force larger than anticipated, coming through the southern woods. Callum is holding, but he says he cannot guarantee it for much longer." Kian's gaze snapped back toward Draven, still kneeling in the clearing, and understanding dawned across his features with terrible clarity. "You knew," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This entire challenge, this fight, it was never about honor or tradition. It was a distraction, exactly like the scouts at my own border 2 nights ago." Draven said nothing, though the faint, satisfied smile finally breaking across his exhausted face confirmed everything Kian needed to know. "We need to move, now," Kian said, turning sharply toward his people, all trace of victory forgotten in the face of this new, urgent crisis. "Elena, stay close to me. Whatever waits back at that estate, we face it together." The drive back felt endless, despite the driver pushing the vehicle faster than Elena had thought possible along the narrow forest roads, tires skidding slightly on tight curves as Kian barked orders into his phone, coordinating with Callum in short, clipped sentences that revealed just how dire the situation had become. Elena gripped the door handle beside her, her knuckles white, watching the trees blur past, while dread built steadily in her chest with every passing mile. "How bad is it?" she finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Kian lowered his phone, his expression grim in the dim interior light. Callum has managed to hold the main entrance, but they breached the eastern wing nearly 10 minutes ago. He has pulled remaining guards back toward the central hall to protect the household staff who could not evacuate in time. Evacuate to where? Elena asked. I thought the estate was supposed to be secure. Secure against scouts and small incursions, Kian said, frustration evident in his voice. Not against a coordinated assault this size. Draven committed more resources to this than any of us anticipated, which confirms exactly how much he wanted this outcome from the very beginning. The vehicle finally broke through the tree line, and Elena's breath caught at the sight awaiting them. Smoke rose from one corner of the estate's eastern wing, and even from this distance she could see figures moving across the grounds, flashes of motion too fast and fluid to be entirely human, the unmistakable signs of a battle already well underway. Stay in the vehicle until I say otherwise, Kian instructed firmly, as they approached the gates, though Elena had no intention of remaining passive while people fought, and possibly died, defending a place that had become, in the span of only 2 days, something closer to home than she expected. The moment the vehicle stopped, Kian moved with startling speed, shedding his composed exterior entirely, as something wilder took over his movements, his shirt already torn at the shoulder, as he sprinted toward the sounds of conflict echoing from deeper within the grounds. Elena scrambled out after him despite Freya's sharp warning, following at a careful distance, unwilling to simply wait and wonder while everything she had come to care about hung in the balance. The scene inside the gates was chaos. Guards from Kian's estate locked in fierce combat, with intruders wearing no visible emblem, their movements just as unnaturally quick and powerful as anything Elena had witnessed at the border clearing only hours before. Smoke curled across the lawn in thick gray ribbons, stinging her eyes, and somewhere near the fountain, a young guard staggered backward under a heavy blow, before recovering, and driving his attacker back with a burst of speed that blurred at the edges of her vision. Kian waded directly into the fighting, his presence alone seeming to shift the tide of battle as his own guards rallied at the sight of their alpha's return, pushing back against the intruders with renewed determination. Elena pressed herself against the cover of a low garden wall, watching the chaos unfold, with her heart hammering violently against her ribs, searching desperately for any sign of Callum among the fighting. She finally spotted him near the estate's main entrance, blood streaked across one side of his face, still standing and directing the remaining defenders, despite clear exhaustion weighing on his movements. He called out sharp, clipped instructions to a pair of guards flanking the doorway, pointing them toward a gap in the line where 2 intruders had nearly broken through, and within seconds, the defenders closed ranks again, pushing the attackers back with renewed coordination that Elena recognized, even from a distance, as the product of careful training rather than desperate improvisation. A sharp cry drew her attention toward the eastern wing, where flames had begun licking higher along one section of the roofline, smoke thickening the air with acrid tension. Through the haze, Elena spotted several figures retreating from the main battle, moving instead toward a side entrance that led, she suddenly remembered from her tour of the estate 2 days before, directly toward the library where crucial records and defensive plans had been discussed only the night before. Without fully considering the danger, Elena moved instinctively toward Callum, catching his attention despite the surrounding chaos. The library, she said urgently. Several of them are heading toward the library, not the main fighting. Callum's eyes widened with sudden understanding. They are after the records, the maps we studied last night, anything revealing our defensive weaknesses and the estate's full layout. Or something else entirely, Elena said, a cold suspicion forming rapidly in her mind. Someone who already knew exactly where to find what they wanted. Callum's expression shifted at her words, some connection sparking behind his exhausted eyes, though there was no time to explore the thought further, as more intruders pressed forward from the tree line, forcing his immediate attention back toward the main battle. Stay hidden, he ordered sharply, before rushing back into the fray, leaving Elena alone at the edge of the chaos, torn between the instruction to remain safe and her growing certainty that something crucial was happening in the library that no one else had noticed yet. She made her decision within seconds, moving carefully along the garden wall toward the side entrance she remembered, staying low and using the smoke and confusion as cover. Her heart pounded with every step, fully aware of how reckless this choice appeared, yet unable to shake the conviction that ignoring her instincts now might cost them something far more valuable than the physical battle raging across the main grounds. The side entrance stood ajar, and Elena slipped inside quietly, moving through familiar corridors now eerily quiet compared to the chaos outside, the muffled sounds of battle growing distant behind thick estate walls. She approached the library doors carefully, pressing herself against the wall beside them, listening intently before daring to look inside. Through the gap in the doorway, she saw two intruders moving with purpose through the shelves, pulling specific documents and maps from drawers, with a precision that suggested they knew exactly what they were searching for, and exactly where to find it. And standing near the entrance, seemingly keeping watch rather than actively searching himself, stood a familiar figure, whose presence sent a wave of cold shock crashing through Elena's chest. Gideon. The young communications aide who had watched so quietly from the library doorway the night before, who Freya had assured her was trusted, faithful, essential to the estate's daily operations, now stood calmly assisting strangers as they stole exactly the information that had been discussed in this very room only hours earlier. Elena's mind raced, piecing together the timeline with sickening clarity. Gideon had been present during the strategy discussions. Gideon had known the estate's defensive plans. And now, as intruders methodically gathered precisely the documents that would reveal every weakness Kian's people had worked all night to address, Gideon stood watch, protecting them, rather than raising any alarm. Elena's breath caught painfully in her throat as understanding crystallized fully. The attack on the estate had not simply been well planned by Draven's forces alone. It had been guided, precisely and effectively, by someone already trusted within these very walls. She pressed herself further against the wall, her mind racing through what to do next. Confronting Gideon alone was impossible, not against two armed intruders, and a traitor who clearly understood the estate better than most. Yet if she retreated now, the documents would already be gone by the time she found Callum or Kian, and whatever advantage those maps and plans offered Draven's forces would be lost beyond recovery. Her phone, she realized suddenly, still sat in her pocket, forgotten since the chaos of the morning had swept her along without pause. She eased it out carefully, fingers trembling slightly as she typed a hurried message to Freya, the only number she had saved since arriving at the estate 2 days before. Library. Gideon is helping them. They're taking the maps. She hit send, and prayed the message would reach someone in time, though the ongoing battle outside made any response uncertain at best. Elena remained frozen against the wall, watching through the gap as the two intruders finished gathering documents into a canvas bag, Gideon glancing nervously toward the corridor every few seconds, as though sensing, on some instinctive level, that he was no longer entirely alone. Then his eyes met hers directly through the gap in the doorway, and Elena's heart stopped entirely. For one frozen, terrible moment, neither of them moved, Gideon's expression shifting rapidly from shock to calculation, clearly weighing what her presence meant, and how quickly he needed to act, to prevent her from raising an alarm. Elena did not wait to discover his decision. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing loudly against the stone floor, despite her best effort at silence, adrenaline overriding any pretense of caution now that concealment had failed entirely. "Stop her," she heard Gideon hiss behind her, followed immediately by the sound of pursuit, quick and far too close for comfort. Elena's lungs burned as she sprinted through unfamiliar corridors, taking turns almost at random, praying each choice led toward the main hall, rather than deeper into the estate's confusing layout. A hand grazed her shoulder from behind, and she twisted away just in time, stumbling into a narrow side passage that opened, thankfully, into a small courtyard she vaguely remembered passing during her tour 2 days before. She burst through the courtyard doors, directly into the chaos of the ongoing battle, momentarily disoriented by the sudden noise and smoke after the eerie quiet of the interior corridors. A guard nearby turned sharply at her sudden appearance, weapon raised instinctively, before recognition crossed his features, and he lowered it just as quickly. "Miss Marsh," he said urgently, "you shouldn't be out here." "Gideon," Elena gasped, struggling to catch her breath while pointing back toward the corridor she had just escaped. "He's a traitor. He's helping them. They're taking documents from the library. Please, someone needs to stop them before they escape with everything." The guard's eyes widened with immediate understanding, and he moved swiftly, calling out to 2 others nearby, before all three sprinted toward the courtyard entrance Elena had just emerged from. She pressed her back against the nearest wall, chest heaving, watching anxiously as the guards disappeared into the corridor in pursuit of Gideon and the stolen documents. Across the courtyard, Elena spotted Kian for the first time since the fighting had begun, his shirt torn and bloodied, though the wounds visible on his skin already appeared to be healing at a rate that should have been impossible for any ordinary person. He fought with brutal, controlled efficiency, each movement decisive and final, clearing space around himself with an intensity that left the remaining intruders scrambling to retreat rather than press their advantage further. Within minutes, the tide of battle shifted decisively. Whatever coordination Draven's forces had relied upon collapsed the moment their numbers began thinning under the combined pressure of Kian's guards, and soon the remaining intruders broke entirely, fleeing back toward the tree line rather than risk further losses against defenders, who now fought with the ferocity of people protecting something they refused to lose. Kian spotted Elena across the smoke-filled courtyard, and something in his expression shifted instantly, from battle focus to raw, unguarded fear, as he crossed the distance between them in only a few long strides, gripping her shoulders as though needing physical confirmation that she remained unharmed. "You were supposed to stay in the vehicle," he said, though relief softened the sharp edge of his words considerably. "I found something important," Elena said quickly, still catching her breath. "Gideon. He's working with Draven. He was helping them steal our defensive plans from the library." Kian's expression darkened instantly, fury replacing the relief that had briefly softened his features. "Gideon," he repeated, the name carrying weight and betrayal in equal measure. "Are you certain?" "I saw him myself," Elena confirmed. "He was standing guard while two intruders gathered documents. I sent guards after him, but I don't know if they caught him before he escaped." As if summoned by her words, the same guard she had spoken with earlier reappeared at the courtyard entrance, breathing hard, his expression grim as he approached Kian directly. "Alpha," he said, "we caught the two intruders attempting to flee through the eastern gate, along with the stolen documents. But Gideon was not among them. He slipped away before we reached the corridor, likely through the service entrance near the kitchens." Kian's jaw tightened with barely restrained anger, though his voice remained controlled when he spoke. "Search the entire estate. I want every exit watched, every possible route he might have taken, thoroughly checked. He does not leave these grounds if he is still within them." The guard nodded sharply and hurried away to relay the order, leaving Kian standing amid the settling chaos of the courtyard, his gray eyes distant, with the weight of fresh betrayal added atop everything else this exhausting day had already demanded of him. "I trusted him," Kian said quietly, more to himself than to Elena. "He has served this household for 2 years. I never once suspected. Sometimes the people closest to us hide the deepest secrets," Elena said gently, though her own mind raced with unanswered questions about how long Gideon had been working against them, and how much damage his betrayal might have already caused before her chance discovery in the library corridor. Callum arrived moments later, exhaustion and relief mixing across his bloodied features, as he took stock of the courtyard, the retreating intruders, and finally Elena, standing safely beside Kian, despite clear evidence that she had ventured directly into danger, rather than remaining protected as instructed. "The estate is secure for now," Callum reported. "Casualties are being tended to, and the fires in the eastern wing are under control. But Alpha, we need to discuss what this means moving forward. If Gideon has been working against us, we cannot know how much of our security he has already compromised, or how deeply his betrayal runs within our ranks." Kian nodded grimly, his arms settling protectively around Elena's shoulders as the full weight of the day's events finally seemed to catch up with him. "Then we begin uncovering the truth immediately. Every plan we made, every defense we built, must now be reconsidered, with the assumption that Draven already knows far more than we ever intended him to learn." Elena leaned slightly into Kian's side, exhaustion and lingering fear finally beginning to overwhelm the adrenaline that had carried her through the chaos of the past hour. Yet beneath the fatigue, a quiet resolve remained steady within her. She had uncovered the traitor hiding among trusted allies, and whatever came next in this dangerous, unfamiliar world she now found herself part of, she intended to face it with the same clear eyes and determined resolve that had carried her safely through this harrowing morning. 3 days passed following the attack, each one filled with careful, methodical work, as Kian's people searched the estate grounds and surrounding forest for any trace of Gideon, though he seemed to have vanished as thoroughly as smoke into the wind. Callum led the search personally, his frustration mounting with each fruitless day, while Freya worked alongside a small team reviewing every document, every conversation, every decision made over the past 2 years, to determine exactly how deeply Gideon's betrayal had reached into the estate's operations. Elena found herself drawn increasingly into these efforts, her paralegal training proving unexpectedly useful as she helped organize records and cross-reference timelines that revealed, piece by careful piece, a pattern of information leaks stretching back further than anyone had initially suspected. Late one evening, hunched over a table in the library with Freya beside her, Elena finally spotted something the others had overlooked. "Look at this," she said, sliding a folder across the table toward Freya. "These reports about supply shipments to the Northern Border Patrol. The dates match almost exactly with times Draven's scouts were spotted testing our defenses. Someone was telling him precisely when our attention would be divided." Freya studied the documents carefully, her expression darkening, as she traced the pattern Elena had identified. "This goes back nearly 8 months. Far longer than we initially believed." "Do you think Kian knows how deep this runs?" Elena asked quietly. "He suspects," Freya admitted. "But confirming it, understanding exactly how much damage has been done, that is different from suspicion alone. This will be difficult for him to accept, Elena. Gideon was more than simply an aide. Kian brought him into this household himself, vouched for him personally, when others questioned his background." Elena leaned back in her chair, rubbing tired eyes as she considered everything the documents had revealed so far. What was Gideon like before all of this? Was there ever any reason to doubt him? Freya thought carefully before answering, her expression thoughtful rather than immediately dismissive. "None that I recall. He arrived quiet and eager to prove himself, worked longer hours than most without complaint, never asked for privileges beyond what his position warranted. If anything, his dedication seemed almost excessive at times, though we simply took it as loyalty rather than something more complicated. Sometimes the hardest workers are hiding the heaviest burdens," Elena said softly, thinking of her own exhausting years at the law firm, the late nights spent proving her worth to people who barely noticed her efforts. She recognized something of herself in the picture Freya painted of Gideon, someone quietly desperate to matter, to be seen as valuable, even while carrying secrets too heavy to share. "You sound sympathetic toward him," Freya observed, studying her carefully. "Despite what his actions may have cost this household, I don't know enough yet to feel sympathy or anger properly," Elena admitted. "But I've learned, especially these past few days, that people rarely betray trust simply because they enjoy causing harm. There's usually something else driving it, fear or desperation or love, twisted into choices that look like betrayal from the outside." Freya considered this for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Perhaps you're right. Regardless, we will know soon enough, once we locate him, and hear whatever explanation he offers, if he offers one at all." They continued working late into the evening, cross-referencing shipment records against patrol schedules, slowly building a clearer picture of exactly how thoroughly Gideon's position had allowed him to funnel information toward Draven's forces over the preceding months. By the time Elena finally set down her pen, her eyes burned with exhaustion, and her mind churned with questions that only Gideon himself could answer. Elena considered this, understanding suddenly why Kian had grown quieter over the past few days, the weight of betrayal settling into him, alongside the exhaustion of constant vigilance since the attack. She found him later that evening on the terrace, where they had first spoken honestly about the dangers surrounding their bond, staring out at the darkened tree line, with an expression far heavier than she had seen from him before. "You've been avoiding me," she said gently, joining him at the railing. "Not avoiding," Kian said, though his tired smile suggested otherwise. "Simply carrying weight I did not wish to burden you with, on top of everything else you have already endured because of me." "I thought we agreed on honesty," Elena reminded him. "That includes the difficult parts, not just the easy ones." Kian turned to look at her fully, something vulnerable flickering behind his gray eyes that she had not witnessed since their very first conversation on the phone, when exhaustion and loneliness had made him speak more openly than perhaps he intended. "I brought Gideon into this house myself, Elena. I saw something in him worth trusting, and I was wrong. That failure sits heavily with me. More than I expected it to. Being wrong about one person doesn't erase everything good you've built here, Elena said. Freya trusts you completely. Callum would follow you into any danger without hesitation. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because you've earned it, again and again, long before Gideon ever arrived. Kian studied her for a long moment, something warm settling into his expression despite the exhaustion still visible beneath it. You have a way of finding clarity in situations I struggle to see clearly myself. Maybe that's what fated bonds are actually good for, Elena said, a small smile touching her mouth despite the seriousness of their conversation. Not just danger and complications, but someone willing to remind you of things you already know, but have simply forgotten under pressure. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, the tension of the past few days easing slightly under the quiet company they offered each other, until Kian finally spoke again, his voice softer now, more personal than the careful diplomat or fierce protector she had witnessed in equal measure since their strange, unexpected meeting began. I meant what I told you that first night, he said quietly, on the phone, before either of us understood what was happening between us. You carry more than you let people see. I recognized that immediately, even before I understood why your voice affected me the way it did. And now? Elena asked. Now that you understand everything, does it change what you feel? It deepens it, Kian said simply. Every day I spend with you, Elena, confirms what my instincts recognized the moment you spoke your name. You are remarkable, not because fate chose you, but because of who you have proven yourself to be, despite everything this world has thrown at you since that first wrong number. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the lingering fear and exhaustion that had accumulated over the past several days. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, a small gesture that felt larger than its size, given everything they had already faced together in such a short span of time. I keep waiting to wake up back in my old apartment, she admitted quietly, faucet still leaking, none of this ever having happened. Some part of me still can't quite believe any of it is real. If it helps, Kian said, a faint smile touching his mouth. I have spent 30 years certain I would never feel anything close to this, and I still find myself needing to remind myself each morning that you are truly here, that this is not simply a dream born from decades of quiet loneliness. We make quite a pair, Elena said softly. Two people who keep expecting this to disappear. Then perhaps we should simply agree to stop expecting that, Kian said, and instead, allow ourselves to believe in what is standing directly in front of us. Their quiet moment was interrupted by Callum's sudden, urgent arrival, his expression tight, with barely restrained excitement, as he crossed the terrace toward them. Alpha, he said, we found something. One of the search teams discovered signs of recent activity near an old hunting cabin at the edge of our territory, close to the boundary line shared with Draven's lands. Tracks suggest someone has been using it recently, possibly as a hideout. Kian straightened immediately, all trace of the earlier vulnerability, replaced by sharp, focused attention. Gideon? We can't be certain, Callum admitted, but the timing and location make it likely. If he has been hiding there since the attack, waiting perhaps for an opportunity to slip across the border entirely, this may be our best chance to catch him before he disappears for good. Kian glanced toward Elena, something conflicted crossing his features as he weighed the decision before him. I need to lead this myself. If Gideon possesses information dangerous enough to threaten this household, I cannot risk sending others while remaining safely behind. Then I'm coming with you, Elena said immediately, anticipating his objection before he could voice it. Elena, this could be dangerous, Kian began, though she cut him off before he could continue further. Everything since that phone call has been dangerous, she said firmly. I refuse to be left behind wondering again, the way I did at the border, whether the people I care about are safe, while I sit uselessly somewhere else. Let me help. I found Gideon once already. My instincts might prove useful again. Kian studied her for a long moment, torn between protective instinct and clear respect for the resolve she had demonstrated repeatedly since their unlikely story began. Finally, he nodded, though reluctance remained visible in the tight set of his jaw. Stay close to me, he said. Whatever we find at that cabin, I will not risk losing you now, not after everything we have already survived together. As the sun began sinking below the tree line, casting long shadows across the estate grounds, Kian gathered a small, trusted team, and together, They prepared to venture into the darkening forest, following tracks that might finally lead them to the traitor, who had brought so much danger and betrayal crashing down upon everything Kian had spent years carefully building. The forest grew denser as they moved deeper along the trail, moonlight filtering weakly through thick canopy overhead, the only sounds their careful footsteps and the distant call of night birds settling into the coming darkness. Elena stayed close beside Kian as instructed, her senses straining against the unfamiliar terrain, grateful for the quiet confidence radiating from the small team surrounding them, despite the uncertainty of what waited ahead. Elena's thoughts drifted as they walked, replaying everything Freya had told her about Gideon's quiet dedication, his eagerness to please, the small details that now seemed, in hindsight, like signs of a man carrying weight far heavier than any of them had recognized at the time. She wondered what she would feel once they finally stood before him, whether anger or understanding would win out once his explanation, whatever it turned out to be, filled in the gaps that speculation alone could not answer. "You've grown quiet," Kian murmured beside her, his voice low enough to avoid carrying beyond their immediate steps. "Second thoughts about coming along?" "No," Elena said honestly. "Just thinking about what we might find. Freya told me Gideon always seemed eager, dedicated, someone trying hard to prove himself worthy of trust. That doesn't sound like someone who betrays people easily." "No," Kian agreed quietly. "It doesn't. Which troubles me more than if he had simply been ambitious or greedy. Those motives I could understand and dismiss easily enough. Something more complicated frightens me, because it suggests I missed signs I should have recognized sooner." "You can't blame yourself for trusting someone who worked hard to earn that trust," Elena said gently. Whatever his reasons, the deception was his choice, however it was motivated. Kian said nothing further, though Elena sensed the weight of guilt still pressing on him, despite her reassurance. Guilt that would likely only ease once they understood the full truth waiting for them at the isolated cabin ahead. After nearly an hour of careful tracking, Callum raised a hand, signaling for silence as a small structure came into view through the trees, a weathered hunting cabin nestled against a rocky outcrop, faint light flickering from a single window facing away from their approach. "Someone is inside," Callum whispered, his voice barely audible, even to Elena standing directly beside him. Kian gestured for the team to spread out carefully, surrounding the cabin from multiple angles while he and Elena approached the front more directly, close enough now that Elena could hear faint movement from within, someone shifting restlessly, so perhaps pacing, perhaps simply unable to settle despite the apparent isolation of this hideout. "Gideon," Kian called out, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet forest, firm and commanding, despite the careful restraint underlying it. "I know you're inside. This ends tonight, one way or another." Silence followed for several tense heartbeats, before the cabin door creaked open slowly, revealing Gideon standing just inside the threshold, his face pale and haggard, clearly exhausted from days spent hiding in fear of exactly this confrontation. He raised his hands slowly, showing them empty, though his eyes darted nervously between Kian and the surrounding guards positioned throughout the tree line. "I knew you would find me eventually," Gideon said quietly, his voice carrying none of the careful, unremarkable quality Elena remembered from the library. "I suppose some part of me hoped you wouldn't, though I knew that hope was foolish." "Why?" Kian asked, and the single word carried more weight than any lengthy accusation might have managed, genuine hurt bleeding through the controlled anger in his voice. "I brought you into this household. I trusted you completely. Why betray everything I offered you?" Gideon's expression crumbled slightly, guilt and desperation mixing across his tired features. "Draven found my sister 3 years ago, before I ever came to serve you. She lives in his territory, has for years, and he made it very clear what would happen to her if I refused to share information whenever he requested it. I never wanted this, Alpha. I swear that to you now, whatever it's worth after everything I've done." "How did he first approach you?" Kian asked, his voice quieter now, though the underlying tension remained. Gideon's hands trembled slightly as he continued. "A letter arrived one evening, shortly after I began serving your household. No signature, only details about Mira's location, a photograph proving he knew exactly where to find her, and a simple instruction to await further contact. I nearly came to you immediately, Alpha, I want you to know that. But then the second letter arrived, describing precisely what would happen to her if I involved anyone else in what he called our arrangement. I was young, frightened, and utterly convinced I had no other choice but to comply. And every month since, Elena said quietly, filling in the picture forming clearly in her mind. He asked for more. Small things at first, Gideon admitted. Patrol schedules, minor details that seemed harmless enough to justify the silence I kept, but it grew, gradually, until I found myself sharing things I knew would cause genuine harm, each time convincing myself it was the only way to keep Mira safe just a little longer. Elena watched Kian's expression shift, anger tempering slightly with something closer to weary understanding, though the underlying betrayal clearly remained sharp and painful regardless of Gideon's explanation. You could have come to me, Kian said. Told me the truth the moment Draven approached you. I would have protected your sister. Found a way to bring her safely away from his territory. I was afraid, Gideon admitted, his voice breaking slightly. Afraid you would see me as a liability the moment you learned Draven held leverage over me. Afraid you would send me away before I could find another way to protect her myself. And now, Kian asked. What do you want now, Gideon? Why remain hidden here, rather than flee entirely across the border into Draven's protection? Gideon's shoulders sagged, exhaustion and regret settling visibly over his frame. Because I am tired, Alpha. Tired of serving a man who views my sister as nothing more than a tool to manipulate me. Tired of betraying people who never gave me reason to doubt their trust, until fear forced my hand against them. I stayed, because some part of me hoped, however foolishly, that confessing everything might offer some small chance at making this right. Kian studied him for a long, silent moment, clearly weighing the sincerity of this confession against the very real damage Gideon's betrayal had already caused. Elena stepped forward slightly, drawing both men's attention toward her. If what he says is true, she said carefully, then Draven has been using fear and family as weapons long before this attack, controlling people through threats rather than loyalty. That doesn't excuse what Gideon did, but it does suggest the true danger runs deeper than one traitor within these walls. Kian nodded slowly, considering her words carefully, before turning back to Gideon. Where is your sister now, specifically? Held within Draven's main compound, Gideon said. Under constant watch, though not harmed, at least not yet. He uses her safety as leverage, precisely because he understands, I will do almost anything to protect her. Then here is my offer, Kian said, his voice hardening with renewed purpose. Help us understand exactly how deep your information reached Draven's forces, everything you shared and when, and I will personally lead an effort to free your sister from his compound, before this conflict escalates any further. Betray me again, however, and I promise you will regret it far more than you currently fear Draven's retribution. Gideon's eyes widened with something close to disbelief, hope flickering cautiously behind the exhaustion etched into his features. You would still help her? After everything I've done? I do not abandon innocent people to suffer for choices they never made themselves, Kian said firmly. Your sister bears no responsibility for the fear Draven used against you. If freeing her ends your usefulness to him and closes this vulnerability within my household permanently, then it serves multiple purposes at once. Elena watched something shift in Gideon's posture, the tension of days spent hiding finally beginning to ease slightly beneath this unexpected offer of redemption, rather than immediate punishment. I'll tell you everything, he said quietly. Every detail, every piece of information I shared, every method Draven used to reach me. I only ask that you truly intend to help my sister, not simply to gather information before dealing with me as you see fit. You have my word, Kian said, extending his hand toward Gideon, in a gesture that carried far more significance than the simple physical action suggested. Whatever comes next, Gideon, we handle it honestly, from this moment forward. Gideon hesitated only a moment before accepting the offered hand, some fragile trust beginning to rebuild itself, like between two people whose relationship had been shattered by fear and manipulation, rather than genuine malice. As Callum and the remaining guards moved forward to escort Gideon back toward the estate, Kian turned to Elena, exhaustion and quiet satisfaction mixing across his features in equal measure. You saw something in this situation I nearly missed entirely, he said. My anger blinded me to the possibility that Gideon's betrayal came from desperation, rather than genuine disloyalty. Everyone deserves a chance to explain themselves before judgment, Elena said, even when what they've done causes real harm. Sometimes understanding why someone breaks matters just as much as addressing the damage that break caused. Kian reached for her hand as they began the walk back toward the estate. The forest quieter now, the tension of the confrontation slowly easing into something closer to cautious relief. "This bond keeps surprising me," he said softly. "Not simply because fate chose you, Elena, but because of everything you continue to teach me about mercy and clarity, even in moments when I struggle to find either quality within myself." But even as relief settled over the small group making their way back through the darkened forest, a new concern had already taken root in Elena's mind. If Draven had used Gideon's sister as leverage to secure information for months, there was no guarantee he would release his hold on her quietly, especially once he discovered his source within Kian's household had been exposed and turned against him entirely. Back at the estate, Gideon spent the following day sharing every detail he could recall, working alongside Freya and Callum to map exactly how deeply his forced betrayal had compromised their defenses, while Kian spent hours in quiet conversation with trusted allies from neighboring territories, carefully building support for what he intended to be a direct rescue of Gideon's sister, rather than another prolonged conflict that risked further bloodshed on both sides. Elena found herself included in these discussions more often than she expected, her outsider perspective proving valuable precisely because she approached each problem without the weight of decades-old traditions clouding her judgment. Late one afternoon, as Kian reviewed a rough map of Draven's compound with Callum, Elena noticed something in the layout that seemed to spark an idea. "This section here," she said, pointing toward a smaller building set slightly apart from the main compound. "Gideon mentioned his sister is held under constant watch, but not treated as a true prisoner in the traditional sense. If she isn't confined within the main fortified structure, that suggests fewer guards, possibly an opportunity to reach her without triggering the compound's primary defenses." Callum studied the map more closely, considering her observation with genuine interest. "She may be right, Alpha. Draven likely keeps her separate specifically to avoid drawing attention to her importance. Treating her as a genuine prisoner within the main structure would raise questions among his own people about why an ordinary woman warrants such heavy security." Kian nodded slowly, calculation replacing some of the tension that had lingered since Gideon's confession the night before. "Then perhaps a small, quiet team stands a better chance than any direct confrontation. Gather Gideon. He knows the compound's layout better than anyone else available to us, and his knowledge could prove essential to executing this quickly and quietly." The plan came together over the following hours, careful and deliberate, built around speed and precision, rather than the kind of overwhelming force that risked escalating tensions into open warfare between the two packs. Elena insisted on joining the team despite Kian's initial reluctance, her calm reasoning finally winning him over once again. "I won't be in the way," she promised, "but Gideon trusts me now. After everything at the cabin, having someone present who isn't purely part of your enforcement structure might help keep his sister calm once we reach her, especially if she has no idea what's happening or who we are." Kian relented, though he made her promise to remain close to Freya throughout the entire operation, a condition Elena readily accepted given the clear danger involved in infiltrating enemy territory, however carefully planned the approach might be. The days leading up to the operation passed in careful preparation, Freya drilling Elena on basic evasion techniques each morning in the estate's private training yard, patiently correcting her stance and footwork until movements that had felt clumsy and foreign began settling into something closer to instinct. Elena's muscles ached each evening from unfamiliar exertion, yet she pushed through the discomfort, driven by a determination to prove herself capable of contributing meaningfully, rather than simply being protected through every dangerous moment ahead. "You learn quickly," Freya observed one afternoon, watching Elena successfully evade a mock grab for the third time in a row. "Most who come from outside our world struggle far longer before movements like these become natural." "I've had good motivation," Elena said, catching her breath. "I refuse to be the reason something goes wrong because I couldn't keep up." Freya's expression softened slightly, something like genuine respect flickering behind her usual composed demeanor. "You have already proven yourself far more capable than most would expect, Miss Marsh. Whatever fate decided in connecting you to Kian, I no longer doubt it chose wisely." Kian, meanwhile, spent long hours in quiet correspondence with allies across neighboring territories, carefully laying groundwork that Elena did not fully understand until much later, planting seeds of support that would prove essential should Draven's forces prove more dangerous than their careful planning anticipated. Gideon assisted wherever possible, his knowledge of the compound's routines and guard rotations providing crucial details that shaped every aspect of the operation's timing and approach. By the evening they finally departed, Elena felt more prepared than she would have believed possible, only days before. The fear that had once defined every unfamiliar moment in this world, now tempered by genuine skill and careful understanding of exactly what awaited them beyond the boundary line. They moved under cover of darkness 2 nights later, a small team consisting of Kian, Freya, Callum, Gideon, and Elena, slipping through the forest bordering Draven's territory with practiced stealth that left Elena deeply grateful for the training Freya had insisted upon over the preceding days, teaching her enough basic movement and awareness to avoid becoming a liability during the operation. The boundary line itself passed almost unnoticed, marked only by a subtle shift in the forest's character, older growth giving way to younger trees that Gideon explained had been planted decades earlier as a natural buffer between the two territories. Elena's heart pounded steadily as they crossed into land she had never set foot on before, acutely aware that every step now carried them deeper into genuine enemy territory, far from the relative safety of Kian's estate. "Stay low near the ridgeline ahead," Freya whispered, gesturing toward a rise in the terrain visible faintly through the darkness. "Draven's patrols favor high ground for visibility. We'll want to move through the depression just beyond it instead." They adjusted course accordingly, Gideon confirming with quiet nods that the route matched patrol patterns he remembered clearly from his months of forced cooperation with Draven's forces. Twice they paused entirely, flattening themselves against the forest floor as distant voices carried faintly on the night air, patrol members exchanging bored conversation that gradually faded as the guards moved further away, without ever suspecting intruders lay hidden nearby. "How much further?" Elena breathed, her muscles beginning to ache from the tension of moving so carefully for so long. "Not far," Gideon whispered back. "The compound's edge lies just beyond this next stretch of trees. Mira's building sits close to the perimeter, thankfully, which should minimize how deep we need to venture." They pressed onward, and gradually the trees thinned enough to reveal the compound itself in the distance, a cluster of buildings far more fortified than Kian's own estate, tall fencing topped with visible watchpoints, though Gideon had assured them repeatedly that Mira's smaller building sat outside the most heavily guarded inner ring. Gideon led them unerringly toward the smaller building he had described, his knowledge of the compound proving exactly as valuable as Kian had hoped. Only 2 guards patrolled the immediate area, their attention clearly focused more on routine boredom than genuine vigilance, precisely the kind of complacency Elena's earlier observation had predicted. Callum and Freya moved with silent efficiency, subduing both guards within moments, quick and controlled enough that no alarm sounded across the surrounding compound. Gideon rushed forward toward the building's entrance, his hands shaking slightly as he worked the lock with practiced familiarity. "Mira," he whispered urgently as the door swung open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished room where a young woman sat curled on a narrow bed, startling awake at the sudden intrusion. "It's me. I've come to bring you home." The woman, Mira, stared at her brother with wide, disbelieving eyes before rushing forward into his arms, tears streaming silently down her face as relief and shock mixed together in equal measure. "I thought you had abandoned me," she whispered. "I thought Draven had finally decided I was no longer useful to him." "Never," Gideon said fiercely, holding her tightly. "I would never abandon you, Mira. I made mistakes trying to protect you, terrible mistakes, but I never stopped trying to find a way to bring you home safely." Elena watched the reunion with a tight throat, understanding now, more fully than ever, the desperate love that had driven Gideon toward betrayal in the first place. A love not so different from what she recognized growing steadily between herself and Kian, despite the impossible circumstances that had brought them together. "We need to move quickly," Kian said quietly, though compassion softened the urgency in his voice. "Draven's guards will notice the missing patrol soon enough." They moved swiftly back through the forest, Mira supported carefully between Gideon and Freya, as exhaustion and shock made walking difficult for her, the entire team maintaining careful vigilance for any sign of pursuit. They were perhaps halfway back toward the safety of Kian's territory when a sharp horn sounded behind them, distant but unmistakable, confirming that their absence had finally been discovered. "They know," Callum said grimly. "We need to move faster." The team broke into a careful run, Elena's lungs burning with the effort of keeping pace across uneven forest terrain in near total darkness. Adrenaline the only thing keeping exhaustion at bay, as the sounds of pursuit grew steadily closer behind them. Just as the boundary marker separating the two territories came into view through the trees, several dark shapes emerged from the shadows ahead, blocking their path entirely. Draven himself stood at the center of the group, his expression cold and furious in the moonlight, clearly having anticipated exactly this route once his people discovered the breach at the compound. "Clever," he said, his voice carrying dangerous calm across the small clearing where both groups now faced each other. "Using my own trader's knowledge against me, I should have expected as much once I realized Gideon's usefulness had likely expired." "This ends now, Draven," Kian said firmly, stepping slightly in front of Elena despite her earlier insistence on standing beside him rather than behind. "You lost our contest at the border fairly. Continuing this conflict only risks consequences neither of our packs can afford." "You misunderstand," Draven said, his cold smile widening slightly. "This was never simply about the girl you claim as your fated mate, Kian. It was always about testing your weaknesses, learning your defenses, and now, finally, about ensuring you understand precisely how vulnerable you remain, regardless of any contest won at that border clearing." He raised one hand slowly, and Elena felt her stomach drop as more shapes emerged from the surrounding darkness, far more than the small team standing against them could possibly hope to overcome through simple speed or stealth alone. "Whatever happens next," Draven continued, his voice carrying clearly through the tense silence of the clearing, "know that I intend to finish what should have ended properly at that border 3 days ago." Kian's body tensed beside her, every muscle coiled and ready, and Elena felt the shift happening before she fully understood it, some deep, ancient part of him rising to meet the threat surrounding them. But before he could move, before the clearing could erupt into the violence Draven so clearly intended, a new sound cut through the tense silence, low and rolling, carried on the night wind from multiple directions at once. Howls, dozens of them, echoing through the forest from every side, drawing closer with each passing second. Draven's confident expression faltered slightly, his eyes darting toward the tree line as the sound grew louder, more distinct, until finally shapes began emerging from the darkness. Not more of his own forces, but allies Elena did not recognize, wearing emblems distinct from both Kian's silver wolf and Draven's own jagged symbol. "The Northern Alliance," Callum said quietly, relief flooding his exhausted voice. "Kian reached out to them days ago, in case this exact situation arose." Draven's confidence crumbled visibly as the newly arrived forces spread through the clearing, their numbers now clearly matching and quickly surpassing his own. A tall woman stepped forward from among the new arrivals, addressing Draven directly with cold authority. "Word of your methods has finally reached every territory bordering your own, Draven," she said. "Manipulation, coercion, using innocent family members as leverage against those forced to serve you. The Alliance no longer recognizes your claims as legitimate under any tradition we honor." Draven's jaw tightened, fury and desperation mixing across his features as he realized the balance of power had shifted decisively against him within mere moments. "This is not your conflict," he snarled. "It became our conflict," the woman replied evenly. "The moment your ambitions threatened to destabilize peace, we have all worked to maintain for generations. Stand down now, Draven, or face consequences far more severe than anything Kian alone could have brought against you." For a long, tense moment, Draven remained frozen, clearly calculating whether any path remained that might still favor his ambitions, despite the overwhelming odds now assembled against him. Finally, visibly seething, he lowered his raised hand, signaling his own forces to stand down as well. "This is not finished," he said, though the hollow defiance in his voice confirmed exactly how thoroughly his plans had collapsed. "You have not seen the last of me, Kian Voss." "Perhaps not," Kian replied evenly, though the fierce protectiveness radiating from him remained undiminished despite the immediate danger passing. "But you will find, should you attempt anything like this again, that I am no longer facing you alone. The Alliance stands watching now, Draven, and they will not look away easily." Draven's forces retreated slowly back toward their own territory, the Northern Alliance escorting them carefully, to ensure no further aggression flared before the tense standoff fully dissolved. Draven himself lingered only a moment longer, his cold eyes finding Elena across the clearing, something calculating, and resentful flickering behind his defeat. "Enjoy this victory," he said quietly, meant only for her ears, despite the distance between them. Fate is rarely so generous twice. Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness, following his retreating forces back across the boundary line, leaving the clearing finally, blessedly quiet in the aftermath of danger that had threatened to consume everything Kian and his people had worked so carefully to protect. Elena released a breath she had not realized she was holding, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her, as adrenaline began draining away, leaving raw exhaustion in its place. Kian caught her gently as she swayed slightly, his arms wrapping around her with a tenderness that carried every ounce of fear and relief he had held back throughout the confrontation. "You're safe," he murmured against her hair. "It's over, Elena. Whatever comes next, this immediate danger has finally passed." Around them, the small team began the careful process of regrouping. Gideon, still holding tightly to his sister, Mira, both siblings finally reunited and safe after months of manipulation and fear that had shaped every difficult choice Gideon had been forced to make. Freya moved among the group checking for injuries, while Callum coordinated briefly with the Northern Alliance leader before she and her forces melted back into the forest, their assistance offered and accepted without need for lengthy ceremony or thanks. The journey back to the estate felt entirely different from the tense flight that had carried them away from Draven's compound only an hour before, exhaustion replaced now by quiet, grateful relief as the small group made their way through moonlit forest toward safety they had genuinely earned through courage and careful planning, rather than pure fortune alone. Once inside the estate's familiar walls, Kian ensured Mira received proper care and a quiet room to recover from months of captivity, while Gideon remained close beside her, gratitude and lingering guilt mixing visibly across his exhausted features as he thanked Kian repeatedly for honoring a promise made under circumstances that could easily have justified abandoning any mercy at all. "You didn't have to help her," Gideon said quietly, finding Kian alone in the study later that night. "After everything I did, you could have simply dealt with me as a traitor deserves and left Mira to whatever fate Draven intended for her." "I told you once already," Kian said, "that I do not abandon innocent people to suffer for choices they never made. That remains true regardless of the circumstances surrounding those choices, Gideon. Your sister deserved rescue. Your honesty, once finally offered, deserved acknowledgement rather than only punishment." "What happens to me now?" Gideon asked, uncertainty clear in his voice. Kian considered the question seriously before answering. "You will remain under careful watch for some time, understandably. Trust, once broken, rebuilds slowly, rather than all at once. But you will remain part of this household, Gideon, given the chance to prove through actions, over time, that the man who confessed everything at that cabin represents who you truly are, rather than the choices fear once forced upon you." Gideon's shoulders sagged with visible relief, gratitude replacing much of the guilt that had weighed on him since his confession. "Thank you, Alpha. I will not waste this chance." As Gideon left to check on his sister once more, Elena appeared in the study doorway, having overheard much of the conversation, while waiting quietly nearby. Kian turned toward her, exhaustion evident in his features, though something warmer, steadier, remained visible beneath the fatigue. "You handled that with more grace than most alphas would have managed," Elena said, crossing the room to join him near the fireplace. "I had good guidance," Kian said, reaching for her hand. "You taught me, over these past difficult days, that understanding someone's reasons matters as much as addressing the harm they caused. I don't think I would have offered Gideon this chance without your influence helping me see past my own anger." Elena smiled softly, settling beside him as the fire crackled quietly, filling the study with warm, comfortable light, after days spent immersed in danger and uncertainty. "We make a good team," she said. "Somehow, despite everything, we do." "More than a good team," Kian said, turning to face her fully, his gray eyes steady and serious, despite the gentleness of his tone. "Elena, these past days have shown me something I never expected to find, not simply a fated bond, but a partnership built on honesty, courage, and genuine care that neither destiny nor tradition could have guaranteed on their own. Whatever the old stories say about mates chosen by fate, I choose you as well, freely, completely, beyond anything fate alone decided for either of us." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest, tears gathering unexpectedly at the sincerity in his words. Everything they had faced together over these harrowing days, settling finally into something steady and certain, rather than uncertain and frightening. "I choose you too," she said quietly. "Not because a phone call connected us by accident, but because of everything I've learned about who you truly are, since that accident brought us together." The following weeks brought gradual peace to the estate, Draven's territory quiet and watchful, following his humiliating retreat before the Northern Alliance, while Gideon slowly began rebuilding trust through consistent, careful service, his sister Mira recovering steadily under the estate's protective care. Elena found herself settling into this strange new world with growing confidence, no longer the frightened woman who had opened her apartment door to strangers only weeks before, but someone who had proven, repeatedly, that she belonged fully within the life she had stumbled into through nothing more than a simple wrong number. One quiet morning, Elena finally found the courage to call her sister, Nora, who had left 3 worried voicemails over the preceding weeks, each one more anxious than the last. Elena had sent brief messages assuring her she was safe, staying with someone she had recently met, but she had avoided any real explanation until now, uncertain how to begin describing everything that had happened since that fateful wrong number. "You've been impossible to reach," Nora said, the moment she answered, relief and frustration mixing in her voice. "I was seconds away from filing a missing persons report, Elena. What is going on with you?" Elena took a steadying breath, glancing out at the garden where Kian stood, speaking quietly with Callum near the fountain. "I met someone," she said carefully. "It's a long story, Nora. Longer and stranger than you're going to believe. But I promise, I am safe. Happier than I've been in years, honestly." "Stranger how?" Nora pressed, suspicion evident despite her obvious relief at finally hearing her sister's voice. "I'll explain everything in person," Elena said, smiling slightly at the memory of just how impossible her explanation would sound over the phone. "Come visit next weekend. Bring an open mind, and maybe don't schedule anything else that day, because this conversation is going to take a while." Nora laughed, though uncertainty still colored her voice. "You're scaring me a little, Elena." "Don't be scared," Elena said gently. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I just need you to trust me long enough to see it for yourself." They talked for nearly an hour after that, Elena carefully avoiding specifics while reassuring Nora as best she could, promising answers soon enough, grateful beyond words that her sister's steady presence in her life remained unchanged, despite everything else that had transformed so completely in recent weeks. Nora arrived the following weekend exactly as promised, stepping out of her modest sedan at the base of the estate's long gravel drive, with an expression caught somewhere between awe and disbelief, as she took in the towering stone building rising before her. Elena met her at the front steps, pulling her sister into a tight embrace before either of them spoke a single word. "Okay," Nora said finally, pulling back to study Elena's face carefully. "Start from the beginning, all of it. I don't care how long it takes." They walked together through the gardens as Elena explained everything: the wrong number, the silver wolves outside her apartment, Kian's true nature, the danger that had followed, and the peace that had finally settled after weeks of difficulty. Nora listened without interrupting, her expression shifting through disbelief, fear, and finally, something like cautious acceptance as the story unfolded piece by careful piece. "You actually believe all of this," Nora said slowly, once Elena had finished. "Wolves. Fated bonds. Rival packs threatening your life." "I know how it sounds," Elena admitted. "But Nora, I've seen it myself. I've lived through it. This isn't something I could have imagined, and it certainly isn't something I would have chosen to believe without proof." As if summoned by the conversation itself, Kian appeared at the garden's edge, offering Nora a respectful nod as he approached. "You must be Nora," he said warmly. "Elena has spoken of you often. I'm glad you came." Nora studied him carefully, clearly searching for some sign of danger or deception beneath his calm, genuine demeanor. Whatever she found seemed to ease at least some of her worry, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she extended a hand toward him. "If you're the reason my sister finally looks this happy," she said, "then I suppose I owe you my thanks, strange as this entire situation remains." "The happiness belongs to her," Kian said, taking her hand briefly. "I only had the good fortune of recognizing it when I found it." Nora stayed through the following 2 days, gradually warming to the strangeness of the estate and its inhabitants, sharing quiet meals with Freya and Callum, listening with wide-eyed fascination as Gideon and Mira described their own harrowing experience with careful honesty. By the time she finally departed, promising to visit again soon, Elena felt a weight lift from her chest that she had not fully realized she was carrying, grateful beyond measure that the last piece of her old life had finally found its place within the new one she had built. On a clear evening several weeks later, beneath a full moon rising bright and silver over the estate's ancient stone walls, Kian gathered his closest allies and the full household together, in the same garden where Elena had first learned the truth about his nature. Freya stood proudly nearby, Callum beside her, while Gideon and Mira watched from a respectful distance, gratitude still evident in their expressions despite the passage of time since their reunion. Kian took Elena's hands gently before the assembled gathering, his gray eyes bright with quiet joy that had replaced the careful restraint she remembered from their very first meeting in this same garden. "Before all who serve this household," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet evening air, "I formally claim Elena Marsh as my mate, chosen not only by fate, but by my own heart, freely and completely, before witnesses who understand exactly what this bond means for our future together." A soft murmur of approval rippled through the gathered crowd, warmth and celebration replacing the tension that had defined so much of Elena's time within these walls since her unexpected arrival. Freya stepped forward first, offering a formal bow that carried genuine respect rather than simple duty, followed by Callum, and finally, by every member of the household who had come to know and admire the woman who had proven herself capable of standing beside their alpha through danger, betrayal, and ultimately, hard-won peace. Elena looked around at the faces surrounding her, people who had been strangers only weeks before, now bound together through shared danger and mutual respect, into something closer to family than she had known since her own mother's passing years earlier. She thought of her small apartment, the leaking faucet, the exhausting nights at the law firm that had once defined her entire existence, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed since one simple mistake, one wrong number dialed in exhaustion, had connected her to a destiny she never could have imagined for herself. Nearby, Gideon stood with his arm around Mira's shoulders, both siblings finally free of the fear that had shadowed them for years, their expressions carrying a quiet gratitude that needed no words to convey. Freya caught Elena's eye across the garden and offered a small, genuine smile, the closest thing to open affection Elena had yet seen from the composed woman who had once been little more than a stern stranger, delivering unsettling news outside her apartment door. Callum raised his glass slightly in her direction, a silent toast between two people who had learned to trust each other through fire rather than comfortable circumstance. The celebration stretched long into the night, laughter and quiet conversation filling the garden where fear had once dominated every exchange, and Elena found herself dancing briefly with Freya, then with Callum, then finally back in Kian's arms, as the gathered crowd slowly dispersed into smaller, contented groups scattered across the moonlit grounds. "I never imagined a night like this," Elena admitted, resting her head against Kian's shoulder, as they moved slowly to music, drifting softly from somewhere near the fountain. Not the danger, certainly, but not this either. This peace, this belonging. "Neither did I," Kian said quietly. "For years I believed my position left no room for genuine happiness, only duty and vigilance. You changed that, Elena, simply by existing, by choosing honesty and courage over fear at every turn since that very first night." "Whatever comes next," Kian said softly, drawing her attention back to him as the celebration continued around them, "know that I will face it beside you, exactly as you have faced everything alongside me since that very first night." Elena smiled, leaning into him beneath the bright silver moonlight, finally, completely at peace with the impossible journey that had carried her from an ordinary, exhausted evening into a life she could never have predicted, yet one she would not trade for anything the world had offered her before. The Alpha King had found his fated mate through nothing more than a simple mistake, but what they had built together since that mistake, forged through honesty, courage, and hard-won trust, belonged entirely to them, chosen freely, regardless of whatever fate had first set into motion. And as the full moon climbed higher above the ancient estate, casting silver light across gardens that had witnessed centuries of history within these old stone walls, Elena Marsh understood with quiet certainty, that she had finally found exactly where she belonged.